Victor Ralston did not knock. He shoved the door open hard enough that it slammed against the wall and left a dent in the plaster. And the three men who came in behind him spread out like they owned the room, which was exactly what they intended to do. Mara Ellison was standing at the kitchen table sorting through her late husband's papers when the largest of the three men swept his arm across the surface and sent every document sliding to the floor. Ralston crouched down, picked up a single page, read it, then let it fall from his fingers like it was garbage. "You've had 8 months," he said. "Nobody waits 8 months." He was not shouting. That was the part that made it worse. If you've ever watched someone walk into a room and immediately make you feel like you don't belong in your own life, stay with us, because this story goes somewhere you won't expect. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next, and hit that like button before we go any further. Drop your city or country in the comments. We want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it really started. The cabin had belonged to Ethan Calloway's grandfather, which meant it had been built without a single nail bought from a store. Every beam was cut from timber felled on the property. Every stone in the fireplace had been carried by hand up the mountain slope. It was not a beautiful structure. It was a stubborn one, the kind of building that stayed standing, not because of good craftsmanship, but because it refused to fall. And Ethan had always felt that described him well enough. He had been gone 22 days, not that he counted exactly. But the way a man tracks a trip when he has nothing waiting at the end of it is different from the way he tracks it when he does. And Ethan had learned to stop thinking about the return trip until he was already on it. Made the mornings easier. Kept him focused on the work, which was the only thing that had kept him functional for the better part of 6 years. The Northern Territories were in decent shape. His foreman, a bow-legged man named Pete Gruber, who had worked cattle since before Ethan was born, had managed things cleanly enough. The water situation at the second pasture was going to be a problem come spring, but that was a problem for a man with a plan, and Ethan had always been good at plans. Plans did not ask questions. Plans did not look at you across a dinner table and remind you that you used to be someone different. He was 2 miles out from the cabin when he saw the smoke. He pulled his horse up short, stood there long enough that the animal shifted under him, impatient. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone had built it. And nobody built a fire in Ethan Calloway's cabin without his permission, because nobody came up this mountain without a reason, and reasons made him cautious in a way that wealth alone cannot explain. He had enemies the way all wealthy men do slow ones, the kind that take years to move and never announce themselves until the moment they've already decided something. He had learned that early. His hand went to the revolver on his hip, not drawing it, just reminding himself it was there. He came down through the tree line at an angle, keeping the cabin to his left so the afternoon light was behind him. Old instinct. He had not been a soldier, but he had grown up in a territory where men settled things without courtrooms, and some lessons go into the body, so deep they stop being thoughts and become reflexes. The smoke was steady, not urgent. Cooking smoke, he recognized, not a fire getting out of hand. He tied his horse at the far post and came around to the door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside with his hand still near the revolver, and what he found was a woman in her 30s standing beside his iron stove with her back to him, stirring something in a pot that smelled like nothing he had eaten in 3 weeks. She did not jump. She did not scream. She turned her head halfway, like she had heard him coming and had already decided what she was going to say. "I heard you were coming home tonight." Her voice was even. "I thought someone should be waiting." Ethan's hand dropped away from the revolver. On the table, his table, the one he had built himself from pine boards the winter. After the funeral, there were 2 plates, set out properly, with the tin cups and the spoons he kept in the drawer. He stood in the doorway of his own home and could not think of a single useful thing to say. Her name was Mara Ellison, and he learned that in pieces over the next half hour, the way you learn things about a person's when neither of you quite knows how to behave in the situation you've stumbled into. She had come up from Silver Creek. She had been directed to the cabin by Pete Gruber, who had apparently decided that Ethan needed someone to check on the place, and had not seen fit to ask Ethan's opinion on the matter. She was a widow. Her husband had died 14 months ago. She had a reputation in town for being direct, which Ethan gathered was the polite way people said she did not perform in the softness that was usually expected of a woman in her position. She was also, as he discovered when she set the food on the table and sat down across from him, like she had every right to be there, an excellent cook. He ate more than he had in weeks. She did not talk much during the meal. She asked him one question about the northern pasture, a specific question, not a polite one, the kind that came from someone who had actually thought about cattle and land, and not just weather, and when he answered it she nodded, like she was filing the information away. She did not ask about his money. She did not ask about the ranch's worth, or his land holdings, or any of the things that Silver Creek seemed to consider the most important facts about Ethan Calloway. She asked about the water table near the second ridge, and whether he had thought about rerouting the runoff channel before the snowmelt. It was the strangest dinner he had had in years. When she stood to leave, he did not stop her. He also did not tell her not to come back. That omission turned out to matter more than either of them expected. She came back 3 days later with a jar of something preserved from the previous summer, and a look on her face that suggested she was not entirely sure why she had come either, which Ethan found oddly reassuring. He had grown very tired of people who were sure about things. Certainty, in his experience, was usually just confidence wearing a mask over the parts it didn't want examined. She did not stay long, that second visit. She left the jar, looked at the loose hinge on the window frame without saying anything, and was gone before he had finished his coffee. When he checked the hinge the next morning, he found it was fixed. He had not heard her do it, and he was a light sleeper. He filed that away too. The weeks that followed were not what Ethan would have called a friendship exactly, because that word implied a kind of intention that neither of them seemed comfortable admitting. It was more like two people who had found, independently and without planning it, that the other person's presence was not an imposition. She came up the mountain every few days. Sometimes she cooked. Sometimes she just sat at the table with her own work spread out in front of her papers, ledgers, things connected to her late husband's estate that she seemed to be working through slowly and with evident frustration. He did not ask about them. She did not offer Silver Creek. Predictably had opinions. He heard about it through Pete Gruber first, who had the good sense to report it like he was describing the weather rather than editorializing about it. People were talking. A wealthy widower and a landless widow spending time together up on Calloway's mountain. It had a shape that the town recognized, and the town was not charitable about the version it had decided on. They said she was after his money. They said she had calculated the whole thing from the moment her husband died, that she had shown up at the cabin because she wanted to secure herself a future that her own situation couldn't provide. Ethan listened to Pete's report without changing his expression. "That what you think?" he asked. Pete took a moment too long to answer, which was itself an answer. "It's what people are saying," Pete said finally. "People said my grandfather was a horse thief for 30 years. He just ran faster than everyone else." He did not bring it up with Mara. He was not entirely sure why, maybe because it felt like an accusation even in the asking, and he had already spent enough years being treated like he owed people explanations for the choices he made on his own property. But he watched her more carefully after that, the way you watch something when you've been told it might be dangerous, and what he saw was a woman who genuinely did not appear to want anything from him. Not the land, not the cattle. She turned down the first offer he made flatly and without drama. He had mentioned offhand that there was work available at the main ranch house if she needed it. She had looked at him for a moment and then said she appreciated the offer, but she was managing. He could tell from the set of her jaw that managing was not the comfortable word for whatever she was actually doing, but she did not press, and neither did he. The second offer came from him without quite meaning it, too. He had noticed she was spending money she didn't have on supplies in town. He had seen the ledger page once, briefly, before she turned it over, and he had mentioned to the proprietor at the general store that he would stand good for whatever credit Mara Ellison needed. The proprietor had told Mara the next time she came in. She came to the cabin that same evening and told him she did not need a benefactor. "I didn't offer to be one," Ethan said. "Then what did you offer to be?" He did not have a clean answer for that and said so. She stood there looking at him, with an expression he was still learning to read somewhere between frustration and something softer that she was working hard not to let show. And then she said, "Don't make decisions about my life without asking me first, even if you think you're helping." It was the most direct thing anyone had said to him in years. Possibly the most direct thing anyone had ever said to him without also wanting something from him. He thought about it for a long time after she left. The thing about having money, real money, the kind that comes from land and cattle and generations of holding on when other people let go, is that it changes how people talk to you. Not in the obvious ways, not always with flattery and yes and whatever you like. Sometimes it changes how they don't talk to you, what they edit out. What they decide you don't need to know, because they've already made the calculation that you'll be fine regardless. Ethan had been managed and maneuvered and carefully handled his entire adult life, and he had spent so long in that fog that he had stopped noticing it was fog at all. He had started to assume that the world had no edges anymore, that everything was negotiable, everything could be softened, everything would eventually find its way to acceptable. Mara had edges. He found it deeply unsettling in a way that he was starting to suspect was actually the feeling of paying attention. It was 6 weeks after the first night, 6 weeks of dinners that were not quite dinners and conversations that were not quite conversations, and a growing sense in the back of Ethan's mind that he had started to anticipate her arrivals in a way that had nothing to do with food when the stranger arrived in Silver Creek. Ethan heard about it the same day it happened, because Pete Gruber heard about it, and Pete Gruber had a particular talent for delivering news in a way that sounded casual and wasn't. The man's name was Victor Rolston. He was an attorney from out east, well-dressed, well-spoken, with the kind of confidence that comes from spending years in rooms where money decides everything, and nobody ever pushes back. He had checked into the hotel, taken a meeting with no one that anyone could identify, and had been seen asking questions about Mara Ellison at the land office. Ethan asked what kind of questions. Pete said, about her husband's estate, about a property filing that had been made 3 years ago, about whether there were any legal challenges pending. The thing about Ethan Calloway that most people in Silver Creek had never fully understood was that his wealth had not made him soft. It had, if anything, made him more careful. A poor man has very little to lose and can afford to wait and see how things develop. A man with thousands of acres of land, a cattle empire, and a name that carried weight in 3 territories cannot afford to be slow. Threats don't announce themselves politely when the stakes are high enough. They come dressed in suits and carrying legal documents, speaking in the precise, mannered language of men who have done this before, and plan to keep doing it until someone stops them. He rode down to Silver Creek the next morning. He found Mara at the small house she rented on the east side of town, and the look on her face when she opened the door told him that Rolston had already been there. There was something in her expression that was not quite fear. Mara Ellison did not seem like a woman who arrived at fear quickly, but it was adjacent to it. The particular look of someone who has been told something they already suspected and have now run out of room to keep not dealing with it. He came to see you, Ethan said. Not a question. Yesterday afternoon, she stepped back to let him in. He wants the land. What land? She was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was deciding how much to say, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she had spent 14 months carrying it alone and did not quite know how to hand any of it to someone else without feeling like she was losing something. He recognized that. He recognized it more than he wanted to. Thomas filed a claim on a piece of property 3 years before he died, she said finally. His family's original parcel, out east of the county. Rolston represents a group that wants it. He says there's a debt attached to the title that I'm legally responsible for. He says I have 30 days to settle it, or he'll move to file a judgment. How much is the debt? She told him. It was not a small number, but it was a number Ethan Calloway could write a bank draft for, without changing the balance in a way that would affect anything. He said so. Mara shook her head before he finished the sentence. This isn't about money, she said. I had someone look at the title 2 months ago. There is no debt. Rolston is manufacturing a claim. He's done it before 3 other properties in the last 4 years. All of them small landowners who couldn't afford to fight back. They either settled or they lost. Ethan was quiet for a moment. What's on the land? She looked at him. That's what I'm trying to find out. The answer came faster than either of them expected, and it came from the least likely direction. Ethan had a contact in Helena, a man named Douglas Farr, who had worked land surveys for the territory before moving into private consulting, and he sent him a message that afternoon. Farr's response arrived within 48 hours and contained information that reframed everything Ethan thought he understood about the situation. The Ellison parcels was sitting on top of one of the largest mineral deposits in that part of Montana. Not gold, not silver. Copper, which in 1887 was beginning to matter more than either, as the electrical age that men in eastern cities kept talking about started to look less like a dream and more like an industry. The copper deposits under that land were, according to Farr's estimate, worth more than Ethan's entire cattle operation, possibly more than his entire land holdings. Thomas Ellison had died 14 months ago, under circumstances that, on reflection, did not look as accidental as they had seemed at the time. Ethan sat with that thought for a long time. He was not a man given to dramatic conclusions. He had built everything he owned on the principle that patience was more valuable than certainty, and that you did not commit resources to a problem until you fully understood its shape. But the shape of this problem was starting to come clear, and it was not the shape of a legal dispute over an old debt. It was the shape of something that had been moving for years, quietly and carefully, and that had now arrived at the moment where the careful part was no longer necessary. He went back to Mara's house with the survey information and put it on the table between them. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry and her jaw was set, and she looked like someone who had just watched a door close on an explanation she had wanted for 14 months and was not grateful to have it, because having it meant it was real. They killed him, she said. I don't know that, Ethan said. I do. Her voice did not waver. He refused 2 offers. 2 serious offers from men in suits who flew out here specifically to buy that land. He told me about them, said they made him uncomfortable, but he couldn't say why. 3 weeks after the second refusal, he fell from his horse on a trail he had ridden 100 times. In daylight, on flat ground, Ethan did not say anything. He was a better rider than I am, she said. He was a better rider than almost anyone I've ever known. The silence in the room was the kind that comes after. Something has been named out loud for the first time. It had weight and heat and the particular quality of something that cannot be taken back. Ethan looked at the survey. He looked at Mara. He thought about Victor Rolston walking into this woman's house and speaking to her in the calm-mannered voice of a man who has done this before and expects to do it again, who has calculated the trajectory of this entire situation and landed on the certainty that she has no one beside her and nowhere to go and no choice but to give him what he came for. He thought about the 2 plates on his table the first night he came home. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Mara looked at him steadily. "I want to fight. That's going to be expensive." "I know, and dangerous. I know that too. I'm going to want to help. I'm going to want to use my money to solve this, and you're going to have to tell me when I'm wrong about how to use it." She considered that for a moment. "Can you do something that somebody tells you is wrong without arguing about it?" "Probably not," he said honestly. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, not the situation for it, but the particular softness that comes when someone says the true thing instead of the comfortable one. "At least you know it." Outside the window, Silver Creek went about its business in the thin winter light. Somewhere across town, Victor Rolston was no doubt sitting in his hotel room, composing correspondence, moving pieces on a board he had been playing for years, certain that he already knew how this ended. He did not know about Ethan Calloway. He did not know, more importantly, about Mara Ellison. And he did not know, because he had never had reason to consider it, what happens when a woman who has been fighting alone for 14 months finally finds someone willing to stand in the same room and fight with her. Not for her, not over her, with her. That distinction was going to cost him more than he had budgeted for. The night before Ethan rode back up the mountain, he stopped at the telegraph office and sent 3 messages. One to Douglas Farr, asking for a full accounting of every land transaction in the county over the past 5 years. One to his banker in Helena, notifying him to prepare for significant legal expenses. And one to a name he had not used in a long time, a name connected to a man in Helena who had a reputation for being willing to go after powerful people in court when most attorneys would not. He did not know yet if any of it would be enough. He knew that doing nothing was not a choice he was capable of making anymore. The ride back up the mountain was cold and took longer than expected because the weather turned midway through, and he spent the last mile in the kind of blowing snow that made everything gray and close and undifferentiated. But when he came through the tree line and saw the cabin through the weather, he noticed something he had not noticed in 6 years. He had not been thinking about the cold. He had been thinking about the morning, about what came next, about a woman sitting across a table from him with a set jaw and an unwillingness to surrender something that was hers, and the question of whether the world was built in a way that rewarded that kind of refusal or punished it. He wanted it to reward her. He had not wanted something that specifically in a very long time. He put his horse in the stable, walked to the cabin door, and stood for a moment with his hand on the latch in the dark and the cold. Then he went inside, built the fire up, and sat at the table alone. There was 1 plate in front of him. He looked at it for a while. Then he got up, went to the cupboard, and set the second one down across from it. He was not entirely sure what that meant yet, but he was starting to think that not knowing what something meant was maybe not the same as not knowing what you wanted. Outside, the snow kept falling over Silver Creek, over the mountain, over a piece of land east of the county that men in suits thought they could take from a widow because they had always taken what they wanted, and no one had ever made them pay for it. That was about to change. Neither of them knew yet how much it would cost, or how cold the road to Helena would get, or what it would require of each of them to keep standing when the men with money and lawyers and patience tried to make it easier to stop. But Ethan Calloway had built his life on things that refused to fall, and Mara Ellison had survived 14 months of grief and legal pressure and a silence so heavy most people would have broken under it. Together they were something that Victor Rolston had not thought to calculate, and that in the end was his most expensive mistake. The 3 messages Ethan had sent the night before came back to him in pieces over the following days. Not as clean answers, but as the beginnings of answers, the kind that opened doors you weren't entirely sure you wanted opened. Douglas Farr's reply arrived first. It was 4 pages long and written in the compressed, efficient shorthand of a man who had spent decades reading land records and had learned that the interesting parts were always in what was missing rather than what was there. Farr had gone back 5 years as requested, and what he found in the county's transaction records was a pattern that looked accidental until you laid all the pieces side by side. 7 parcels had changed hands in the last 4 years in the eastern corridor of the county. 3 of them had been sold under duress debt settlements, 1 foreclosure, 1 estate sale where the heirs had been told the land was nearly worthless. The prices paid in each case were significantly below market value. The buyer in 5 of the 7 transactions was a land holding company registered in Chicago, under a name that Farr had taken the trouble of tracing 1 step further, and that 1 step had led him to a second company, and that second company to a name, the Harlan Cross Mining Syndicate. Ethan read the name twice. He had heard it before. Not recently, years ago, in a conversation he had half forgotten, with a man at a Cattlemen's Association meeting in Helena, who had mentioned it in passing as one of the eastern operations that was moving aggressively into the territory's mineral rights. He had not paid close attention at the time, because it had not been his problem. He was a cattleman. Mineral rights were someone else's puzzle. They were his puzzle now. He rode down to Silver Creek with Farr's report folded in his coat pocket, and found Mara at her rented house doing something he had not expected, which was going through a wooden trunk that she had pulled from under her bed and set in the middle of the floor. The trunk was full of Thomas's papers, not the estate documents she had been working through before, but older things. Letters, survey notes, a hand-drawn map of the eastern parcel that Thomas had apparently made himself, annotated in his careful, compact handwriting, with observations about the soil and the water and a series of notations along the southern boundary that Ethan could not immediately interpret. She looked up when he came in. She did not look like she had slept. "I found something," she said. "So did I." He put the report on the table. "You first." She held up the map. Thomas knew. He knew what was under that land, or at least he suspected it. He made these notes 2 years before he died. "Look at the southern margin." Ethan leaned in. The notations, there were a series of numbers and abbreviated terms that meant nothing to him, but the word he could read clearly, circled twice in Thomas Ellison's handwriting, was copper. "He never told me," Mara said. She was not saying it with anger. She was saying it with the particular exhaustion of someone who has just discovered that the person they loved had been carrying something alone, for reasons they probably thought were protective, and the protection had not worked. "I think he didn't want to worry me. I think he thought he could deal with it himself. Did he contact anyone about what he found?" "Not that I can tell." "He might have," she paused. "There's a letter here from about 6 months before he died, from a man who identified himself as a representative of a business group interested in the territory's mineral potential." Thomas wrote a draft reply. He never sent a finished version that I can find, and in the draft he said the land was not for sale and would never be for sale, and that the business group should direct their interests elsewhere. "Polite," Ethan said. Thomas was always polite. Her voice caught slightly on the word. Just slightly. She moved past it. It didn't help him. Ethan put Farr's report beside the map. "The company that's after your land is called the Harlan Cross Mining Syndicate. They're registered in Chicago, but they operate through local fronts. That's what the land holding company is. Victor Ralston isn't just an attorney. He's their instrument. They send him in, manufacture a legal claim, apply pressure until the owner runs out of money, or options, or both. Then they buy for a fraction of what the land is worth." Mara looked at the report without touching it. "How many people have they done this to?" "At least 7 that Farr could trace. Probably more that he couldn't, and none of them fought back. They couldn't afford to." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a wagon was moving slowly along the main street, a woman walking beside it with a child by the hand. Ordinary morning moving forward the way it always did, regardless of what was happening in the rooms on either side of it. Mara watched it for a moment and then looked back at the table. "Ralston came back yesterday," she said. Ethan had not known that. "What did he say?" "He reduced the time, 20 days now instead of 30. He said there had been a procedural issue with the original notice, and the clock had actually started earlier than he'd indicated." She said it flatly. "The way you repeat something you recognized as a lie the moment you heard it, but couldn't immediately prove." He also mentioned, very casually, that the judge who handles land claims in this district is an old acquaintance of his. "That's not a coincidence." "No." She picked up the draft letter Thomas had written, looked at it, set it down. "He wanted me to feel like I had no floor to stand on. I think he's used to that working, has it?" She looked at Ethan directly. "I haven't signed anything," he nodded slowly. "The name I sent a message to in Helena, Samuel Mercer. He wrote back this morning. He'll take a meeting." "You've heard of him?" "I've heard he's the kind of attorney who takes cases that other attorneys won't, and that he has a particular interest in land fraud operations because there was a case 15 years ago, a ranching family, 3 generations on the land, lost everything to a manufactured debt claim, and he couldn't stop it in time, and it cost him something. He doesn't talk about it, but it's in the record of every case he's taken since. Mara considered that. Motivated by failure. Some men work harder when they owe a debt they can't repay directly, Ethan said. Mercer seems to be one of them, are you? The question caught him somewhere he hadn't expected it to land. He thought about the answer honestly, which was not something he did quickly. I'm motivated by the fact that someone thinks they already know how this ends, he said finally. I find that irritating. Something in Mara's expression shifted, not quite a smile. Still too much tension in the room for that, but the particular look of someone recognizing a truth they hadn't anticipated. That's an honest answer. I'm trying to give more of those. She stood and went to the small stove in the corner of the room, poured 2 cups of coffee, and brought them to the table. It was a small domestic gesture, automatic, the kind of thing a person does without thinking in a space they've inhabited long enough. Then she seemed to realize what she'd done, and there was a brief moment where her hands were uncertain, like she wasn't sure what to do with them now that the cups were down, and she sat without acknowledging it, and Ethan didn't acknowledge it either. If we go to Helena, she said, and Mercer takes the case, and we build something worth fighting with, what happens to the people who already lost their land? That's not a simple question. I know it's not. I'm asking anyway. Ethan drank his coffee. It was too hot, and he drank it anyway. If we can demonstrate a pattern Far's records, the transactions, the same company appearing in multiple cases with the same methods, there's an argument to be made that the previous settlements were obtained fraudulently. Getting those landowners made whole would be a longer fight than your case, and harder. But it would be a fight with a foundation. You've thought about this. I thought about it most of last night. So did I. She looked at him across the table with the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is seeing whether it survives being spoken out loud. I don't want to just save my land, Ethan. I want to make sure they can't do this again. Not to me, not to anyone else in this county. The name came out easily. She had not used it. Before, it had always been that careful, formal distance that they had both maintained, each for their own reasons. He noticed it the way you notice a door opening. That makes the fight bigger, he said. I know. It also makes it more dangerous. If Harlan Cross figures out that this isn't just a widow trying to hold on to one parcel, if they figure out that someone is trying to build a case against their entire operation, they'll stop being subtle, Mara said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then Thomas wasn't subtle either in the end. He drew a map and wrote notes and made it clear he knew what they were after. Look how that worked. The room went very still. Ethan did not look away from her. He understood what she was saying and what she was not saying, which was that she had spent 14 months knowing in her bones that her husband had not fallen from a horse he could have ridden in his sleep, and that making that accusation out loud without proof would only make her look unstable and grief-destroyed, which was exactly the impression that Rolston and his clients would want to cultivate. We need to be careful, he said. I've been careful. It hasn't helped. I mean careful in the specific sense of not giving them a reason to move before we're ready to move. Not careful in the sense of quiet. She absorbed the distinction. How long before we're ready? I want to get Mercer's read on the legal standing first. If we have a case, it needs to be built right. And I want Far to go deeper. There are 4 or 5 names in those transaction records that I'd like to trace further before we walk into a room with anyone. Ralston gave me 20 days. Ralston gave you a deadline he invented to apply pressure. That doesn't mean it's the actual timeline we're operating on. He's set the cup down. I'm going to send Far a second message today, and I want you to do something for me. What? Write down everything you remember about the 2 men who came to see Thomas about the land. Every detail. What they looked like, what they said, how they said it, whether Thomas said anything about where they were staying or who they'd talked to in town before they came to the property. Everything. Mara was quiet for a moment. You think there's a witness somewhere? I think there might be. The kind of operation Harlan Cross is running requires local knowledge. They need someone who knows which landowners are vulnerable, which debts exist, which county officials can be leaned on. That's not something a man from Chicago arrives with. They have someone here. It landed in the room with a particular weight. Mara looked at the window again, at Silver Creek moving past outside, ordinary and unknowing. Someone in town, she said. Or someone connected to it. I don't know who yet. That's the other thing I need Far to look at. She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her cup with both hands and held it the way cold people hold things they want to warm against, even if the coffee had already started to cool. Thomas used to say, she said, that the most dangerous men in any room were the ones who were certain they'd already won. She paused. He was right about most things. He was right about that. He was wrong about being able to handle it alone. Ethan said nothing to that, because there was nothing to say that would be useful, and she wasn't asking for a response. She was saying it out loud, the way you say certain things out loud, not to communicate them to another person, but to hear them in the air, to make them real in a way that keeping them internal never quite manages. He left an hour later with the draft letter in his coat pocket. She had given it to him without being asked, which meant she trusted him with it, which was a thing he did not take lightly, and rode back toward the ranch to send the second message to Farr and to think about the various ways this could still go wrong. There were several. The most immediate one presented itself the next morning in the form of a man Ethan had not seen before, lean, unremarkable, the kind of face that doesn't attach itself to memory easily, who was sitting outside the general store when Ethan came through town, and who was still in more or less the same position, reading the same newspaper, when Ethan came back through 2 hours later. The man did not look up. That was paradoxically how Ethan knew he had been noticed. A man genuinely reading a newspaper looks up when someone passes. A man performing reading does not. He mentioned it to Pete that afternoon. Pete scratched his jaw. Showed up 3 days ago. Took a room at the boarding house on Elm. Asked Margaret Holloway about grazing patterns in the North Territory. Said he was a cattleman looking to move operations west. He's not a cattleman, Ethan said. No, Pete agreed. His hands are wrong. A working cattleman's hands are a specific thing, scarred and calloused in specific places, shaped by specific repetitive work. The man's hands, Pete said, were smooth at the palm and rougher at the fingers, which was the hand of someone who handled papers more often than rope. Silas Crow, Ethan found out through a discreet inquiry 3 days later, was a private investigator who worked primarily for Eastern business interests operating in the territory. He had been in Montana twice before in the previous 3 years, on both occasions preceding significant legal actions against landowners in the county where he'd been stationed. He was good at his work, which meant he was patient and careful, and had very little visible personality, which made him difficult to counter directly. Ethan did not try to counter him directly. What he did instead was more practical. He had a conversation with Pete about varying the routes that the ranch hands used going into town, and another conversation with the telegraph operator's assistant, a young man named Cal, who owed Ethan a favor from a bad winter 2 years ago, about being generally vague with anyone who came in asking about outgoing messages. And then he told Mara, the next time he saw her, that she should assume everything she said within Silver Creek's limits was potentially being listened to, and adjust accordingly. Mara took this information with the particular stillness of a woman who is not surprised by it, but is also not pleased. He's watching now, she said. Probably. Yes. For how long? I don't know. Long enough to get a sense of what we're doing, who we're talking to, whether there's anything worth reporting back. She thought for a moment. So we need to give him something to report that isn't the thing we're actually doing. Ethan looked at her. I hadn't quite gotten there yet. Thomas had a friend in town, a man named Roy Callister, runs the feed supply. He and Thomas would talk for hours about nothing in particular. Roy's a talker, everyone knows it. She paused. If I went to see Roy and mentioned loudly and in passings that I was thinking about taking Rolston's deal, that I'd found out the land wasn't worth fighting for, Crow would hear it and report it, and Rolston would ease up for a few days, thinking they'd won. She looked at Ethan directly. Would that buy us any time? It might, if it's convincing. I can be convincing. She said it without vanity, as a simple statement of capacity. What I can't be is convinced of something I don't believe. But playing a part I've already decided to discard, that's different. He thought about the logistics of it. If Crow reported that Mara was softening, Rolston might hold his next move, might decide to let the deadline pressure do its work without escalating further. That was at minimum several days of room. Several days was not nothing when you needed to build a case. Do it carefully, he said. Don't overcook it. The more natural it sounds, the better it lands. I know how to have a conversation, she said, not unkindly. I know you do. I'm talking to myself as much as you. She went to see Roy Callister the next afternoon. Ethan did not go with her. His presence would have made it less convincing, and spent the afternoon instead at the ranch reviewing Farr's second report, which had arrived that morning and contained 2 pieces of information significant enough that he read both sections 3 times to make sure he wasn't misreading them. The first was a name. Among the county records, cross-referenced against the land transaction data, Farr had found us a series of small payments, and that's not large enough to stand out individually, but consistent, spread over 18 months going to a county land office clerk named Harmon Briggs. The payments appeared in the record as consulting fees for a survey company that Farr could find no evidence of actually existing. Briggs had been in his position for 11 years. He would have had access to filing records, to ownership documents, to the information a Chicago mining syndicate would need to identify which parcels were valuable and which owners were vulnerable. The second piece of information was worse. Farr had traced the timeline of legal challenges against the 7 landowners he'd identified, and in 5 of the 5 cases where the landowner had attempted to contest the manufactured debt claim through the county system, The case had been assigned to the same judge, a district court judge named Elias Cord, who had held his position for 9 years and who had far noted with characteristic understatement a pattern of ruling in favor of the claimant in land dispute cases at a rate significantly above statistical expectation. Ralston had not been bluffing when he mentioned his acquaintance on the bench. Ethan sat with the two names Briggs and Cord and what they meant for the shape of what they were up against. This was not a scheme that a single attorney was running with a client's money. This was infrastructure. This was something that had been built deliberately over years, with multiple people in multiple positions, and it had been built in this specific county because someone had recognized that it was manageable here, that the pieces were in place, that the right combination of insider access and judicial cooperation made it nearly impossible for any individual landowner to find solid footing to stand on. Nearly impossible was not the same thing as impossible. He rode to Silver Creek the next morning and found Mara already at the table with her own notes spread out in front of her, which had been happening with increasing frequency. She had started to keep working between his visits rather than waiting for the next conversation, which meant she was no longer treating this as something being done for her, or even with her, but as something she was driving from her own end. He noticed it and said nothing about it, which was the correct choice. She had found something too. Roy remembered more than I expected, she said. I went to see him. The performance worked, by the way. Crow was within earshot for most of it and didn't bother to hide it very hard. But while I was there, Roy mentioned something. He said that about 2 weeks before Thomas died, Thomas had come in looking troubled. Not frightened exactly. Focused. The way Thomas looked, Roy said, when he'd identified a problem and was working out how to solve it. Thomas had asked Roy if he knew anything about a survey company that had apparently been operating quietly in the Eastern Corridor. What kind of survey company? That's the thing. Roy didn't know the name, but he said he'd heard about them from the county land office, that a clerk there had mentioned them in passing while Roy was filing some paperwork for his own property. She met Ethan's eyes. He said the clerk's name was Briggs. Ethan put Farr's report on the table. He pointed to the section about Harmon Briggs. Mara read it without speaking. When she looked up, the set of her jaw was the hardest he had seen it. Thomas went to the land office, she said. About a month before he died, he mentioned he needed to check on a filing. I didn't ask details, she stopped. He was following the same thread. He got close enough to something that they decided he couldn't be allowed to keep pulling. The room held that conclusion between them without either of them needing to say it plainly. They were past the point of needing to say it plainly. The outline of what had happened to Thomas Ellison was clear enough, now that the silence around its edges was louder than words would have been. If we take this to Helena, Ethan said carefully, and we take it to Mercer, the judge connection, the clerk, the pattern across 7 cases, we're not just challenging Ralston's claim. We're exposing a system that has people in it who have a great deal to lose. Briggs loses his position and likely his freedom. Cord loses the bench. The Harlan Cross Syndicate loses not just this parcel, but potentially their entire operation in the territory. I understand that. Which means the moment they figure out what we're building, they will not be patient. Mara looked at him steadily. Then we need to move before they figure it out. It was that simple, stated that plainly. The window they had, the brief, fragile window created by Mara's performance at Roy Callister's feed store, by Crow's report of a softening widow, by Ralston's probable assumption that the machine was working as it always had, was not a large window. Days, not weeks. The decision about Helena happened not in a single dramatic moment, but in the incremental way that real decisions usually happen, through a series of smaller agreements, each one building on the last, until the accumulated weight of them made the thing inevitable. Ethan contacted Mercer with a fuller briefing that same afternoon. He sent it through the telegraph operator's office, but had Cal encode it in the loose cipher he and Farr used for sensitive correspondence, not sophisticated enough to stop a determined cryptographer, but sufficient to make it unreadable to anyone who glanced at it casually. Mercer's reply came the following morning. It was brief. He had reviewed the summary. He believed there was a case. He needed to see the original documents and the survey data in person. He could meet them in Helena within the week if they could be there. Ethan went to tell Mara. She was ready, which did not surprise him, but which he found himself grateful for, in a way he did not entirely know how to name. She had the trunk packed. She had Thomas's papers organized into a sequence that made sense, earliest evidence first, building to the most recent, structured the way an argument is structured rather than the way grief usually keeps things. She had thought about how to travel, which routes Crow was less likely to be watching, whether they should go together or separately and meet in Helena. Together, Ethan said. Separately is more suspicious at this point, and I don't want you on the road alone. She did not argue with that, which meant she had already made the same calculation. When? Day after tomorrow. Early, he paused. It's going to be cold. The weather's been turning. I know what Montana winter is, she said. I know you do. They looked at each other across Thomas Ellison's papers and Farr's reports, and the hand-drawn map with copper circled twice in a dead man's handwriting. And Ethan thought about the night he had come home to find smoke rising from his chimney and had reached for his revolver before he understood what he was walking into. He thought about 2 plates on a table. He thought about a woman who had spent 14 months alone with a grief that had teeth in it and had not been broken by any of it, which was not the same thing as being unaffected by it, but was something he had come to understand as its own particular kind of strength. I want to say something, he said. Mara waited. I'm not doing this because of the money, or the injustice, although that matters. I'm doing it because he stopped. Found the right words, which were not the easy ones. Because I spent 6 years on a mountain being sure that being alone was a choice I'd made deliberately and not something that had happened to me. And I think I was wrong about that. And it took someone setting a second plate at my table for me to figure it out. The room was very quiet. That's not a small thing to say, Mara said finally. No. She looked at the table, at the papers, at somewhere in the middle distance. Thomas used to say that the bravest thing a person can do is admit what they actually need. A pause. He was also better at saying it than doing it. So am I, probably. Probably both of us, Ethan said. She looked up at him. We leave day after tomorrow. Day after tomorrow. She nodded once. He nodded back. Neither of them said anything further, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, but something else entirely, the kind that comes when 2 people have said enough for one evening and know it, and are comfortable enough with each other to let that be sufficient. Outside, Silver Creek was settling into its evening rhythms, lamps coming on in windows, the smell of chimney smoke moving through the cold air. Somewhere along Elm Street, in his rented room at the boarding house, Silas Crow was writing a report for Victor Ralston that said the widow was capitulating, and the rich rancher had likely been convinced that the situation was not his problem. It was the last accurate report he would write for some time. And in the morning, 2 days from now, before anyone in Silver Creek was awake enough to notice, Ethan Calloway and Mara Ellison would be on the road to Helena with a trunk full of documents and a case that was going to cost the Harlan Cross Mining Syndicate far more than they had ever planned to spend on this particular piece of Montana ground. The winter road was brutal, and neither of them was under any illusion about what was waiting for them at the end of it. But Mara had stopped running 14 months ago, the moment she'd looked at the trail where her husband had fallen and known, in the wordless way that people know certain things, that the world had done something to him that it was trying to make look like an accident. And Ethan had stopped being empty, though he hadn't had a clean word for it until recently, the night he'd gotten up from a table set for one and placed a second plate across from his own. They were not going to Helena because they were brave. They were going because there was no version of themselves at this point that could do otherwise. The road to Helena was the kind of cold that doesn't argue with you. It simply arrives and occupies every part of the world it can reach, and you either move through it or you don't. They left before first light, which was Ethan's preference, and which Mara had agreed to without complaint, already dressed and waiting at the door of her rented house when he came with the horses. She had 1 bag. He had noted the first time she'd come up to his cabin that she traveled light, and he had noted it again now. The single bag, the trunk of documents loaded the night before into the wagon bed and covered with oilcloth against the weather, and not a single indication on her face that she had any reservations about what they were doing. Whether she had reservations and was simply not showing them, he could not be certain. He had learned that Mara Ellison's face was not always a reliable map of her interior. They were 3 miles out of Silver Creek before anyone in town would have been awake enough to notice the wagon gone. Silas Crow was presumably still in his rented room, still operating on the report he had sent Ralston, the report that said the widow was softening, that the situation was resolving itself as expected, that no intervention was required at this time. Ethan had thought about Crow on and off for the previous 2 days, running the man's likely schedule against their own timeline, calculating the window. By the time Crow noticed Mara's house was dark and her horse gone from the livery, they would be far enough along the Helena road that it would not matter. And by the time Crow got a message to Ralston, and Ralston decided what to do about it, they would be sitting in Samuel Mercer's office. At least that was how it was supposed to work. The first hour of the drive was mostly quiet. The kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable, but is simply the natural state of 2 people moving through cold pre-dawn darkness, with something serious waiting at the other end. Mara had her hands in her lap, watching the road. Ethan drove. The horses knew their work and did not need much direction on a straightaway, which gave him time to think, which was not entirely a gift. "You've been to Helena before," Mara said. "Not a question. Several times. Cattlemen's meetings, mostly. One lawsuit years ago over a water rights dispute with a neighbor that went on longer than either of us wanted. Who won? We settled, which meant nobody won and both of us paid attorneys. He paused. I won the water rights in the end because the neighbor sold his land the following year, and the new owner wasn't interested in fighting. Patience. Patience, and the fact that I could afford to wait longer than he could. He said it without pride, as a simple fact about how the world worked that he was not particularly comfortable with. Money is often just patience that someone else can't buy. Mara looked at the road ahead. Thomas couldn't wait them out. He didn't have the resources, I know. That's what they counted on. With him, with everyone else they went after. A pause. They counted on it with me too, they were wrong. They were wrong about me having no one beside me, she said. Not wrong about the resources. If you weren't part of this, I'd have run out of road by now. He appreciated that she said it plainly, without either resentment or excessive gratitude, just an accurate accounting of the situation. You would have found another road, he said. Maybe. She did not sound certain of it, which was honest. Or maybe I would have found a way to fight them and lost, which is a different thing from not trying. They rode in silence for another stretch. The sky was beginning to turn along the eastern horizon, a gray lightning that was not yet dawn, but was the beginning of the preparation for it. The road was frozen solid, which made for smooth going, but was hard on the horses over distance. Tell me about Mercer, Mara said, not what you told me before. Tell me what you think he's actually like. Ethan considered it. I've never met him. Everything I know is secondhand. Then tell me that. People who've worked with him say he's difficult. Not unpleasant exactly, but demanding in the way that people are demanding when they have a high tolerance for hard work, and not much patience for anything less from the people around them. He lost a case early in his career of family, lost everything, and it left a mark. The way it left the mark is that he overbuilds his cases. He doesn't go into a courtroom unless he has 3 times more evidence than he thinks he needs, which makes him slow to commit and thorough once he does. That sounds like the right kind of person for this. I think so. I also think he's going to want to control how we do this, and that's going to create friction. Mara glanced at him. With you, probably. I'm not good at being told to step back when I have resources that could be useful. And with me? You're better at it than I am, but you've also been driving this from your own end for 14 months, and you're not going to hand it to someone else without an argument. She was quiet for a moment. Fair. I'm not saying it's a problem. I'm saying it's a thing we should know about ourselves before we walk into the room, so we don't spend the first hour of the meeting getting in our own way. She turned to look at him more fully than she had been. You've thought about this a lot. I've had 2 days and a long ride. So have I, she said. I've been thinking about what Mercer is going to ask us, about what we can prove versus what we know. Those are different things, significantly different. The pattern of transactions that we can prove, FAR's records, are solid. The Briggs connection, the payments, the non-existent survey company, that's solid if the records are what FAR says they are. She paused. Thomas, that's the thing we know and can't prove. And it's also the most important thing. Ethan did not disagree. The death of Thomas Ellison was the center of what had happened, the point around which everything else organized itself. And it was also the piece that was most resistant to legal evidence. A man had fallen from a horse on a trail he knew well. There were no witnesses. There was no physical evidence of foul play that had survived 14 months of weather and time. There was a widow who knew in her body that it had not been an accident, and a survey map with the word copper circled twice, and the timing of 2 refused offers immediately preceding the death. That was not nothing, but it was not a courtroom argument. Mercer is going to tell us to leave Thomas out of it, Ethan said. I know. At least initially. He's going to want to build from what's provable and get to Thomas from the other direction, through the pattern, through Briggs, through Cord. If the syndicate's operation falls, what happened to Thomas becomes easier to examine. Mara's jaw tightened slightly. He's been in the ground 14 months while they kept operating. Kept taking other people's land. Kept sending Ralston into widows' houses and slamming doors and telling women they had no floor to stand on. She stopped. I understand the strategy. I don't have to be comfortable with it. No, Ethan said. You don't. He did not try to smooth it over or redirect her, which was what most people would have done what he might have done 6 weeks ago, before he had spent enough time with her to understand that what she needed was not comfort in those moments, but the simpleton acknowledgement that the thing she was feeling was accurate. She was not wrong to be angry. The anger was appropriate. Managing it into something more convenient was her choice to make, not something someone else got to do for her. They stopped once, mid-morning, to water the horses at a creek that ran alongside the road. The water was moving fast enough not to have frozen. Mara got down from the wagon and walked a short distance along the bank without explaining why, and Ethan led her, occupied with the horses and the oilcloth on the trunk, which had worked partially loose in the wind. When she came back, her face had the rinsed quality of someone who has taken a few minutes to be alone with something private and has come back ready to continue. She climbed back up without taking his offered hand, which he had extended automatically, and then been slightly embarrassed about, and she noticed and said nothing about it, which he appreciated. They reached Helena late in the afternoon as the light was going flat, and the temperature was dropping in the particular way it drops in Montana, when the sun starts to leave not gradually but with a kind of decisiveness, like a door being shut. Helena was larger than Silver Creek and louder, with the particular energy of a town that was in the process of deciding what it was going to become. There were 2 banks on the main street. There was a new hotel that had gone up in the last 2 years, 4 stories of dressed stone that looked faintly out of place against the older wooden buildings around it. There were men in suits who moved differently from the ranchers and miners and working men, with the brisk, purposeful stride of people who had places to be and money to get there with. Ethan had arranged rooms at a smaller establishment, a boarding house run by a woman named Adele Fitch, who had known his family for 30 years, and who greeted them at the door with the practicality of a woman who had been running a clean, quiet place for 2 decades and had no patience for drama, but abundant patience for people who needed somewhere safe to set their bags down. "You'll want supper," Adele said. It was not a question. "We'll want supper," Ethan agreed. Mercer's office was a 15-minute walk from Adele's boarding house on a side street off the main thoroughfare, in a building that had seen better decades, but was kept up with the particular fastidiousness of someone who had decided that the exterior didn't matter as long as the interior was organized. The sign on the door was plain. No flourishes. They had agreed to go the following morning. The evening was for settling in, for going through the documents one more time in the order Mara had assembled them, for eating Adele's plain and excellent food and sleeping in rooms that were warm and quiet, and not either of their homes. Ethan sat at the small desk in his room that night, with Farr's 2 reports and Thomas's annotated map and the draft letter, and tried to see it all as Mercer would see it, not as a story he already knew the meaning of, but as a collection of evidence presented cold, without context, to someone who needed to be persuaded of its significance. It held together. The chain was not perfect, but it was real. He went to sleep earlier than he usually did and lay awake for an hour anyway, listening to Helena settle into its nighttime sounds, and thought about Silas Crow and what Crow had done when he found the house empty and the horses gone, and realized that his report to Rolston had been built on a performance. He thought about how long it would take Rolston to respond, and what form that response would take, and whether the window they had was as large as he had estimated, or whether they had already made an error somewhere that they couldn't see yet. He did not reach any conclusions. He fell asleep in the middle of trying to, which was its own kind of answer. Samuel Mercer was not what either of them had expected, though Ethan reflected afterward that he was not sure what he had expected exactly. The man was in his late 50s, compact and deliberate in his movements, with gray at the temples and the kind of eyes that assess things quickly, and did not soften the assessment for the sake of politeness. He shook Ethan's hand, shook Mara's hand, gestured toward the chairs on the near side of his desk, and sat down across from them with a notepad already open. "Tell me what you have," he said, in order. "Start with the earliest piece." Mara opened the trunk. She told it in the order she had assembled it, starting with Thomas's survey map and the circled notation, and moving forward through the refused offers and the timeline of his death, and Rolston's arrival, and the manufactured debt and Farr's land transaction records, and the Briggs payments, and the pattern across 7 landowners, and finally at the end Judge Cord. She spoke for nearly 40 minutes without significant interruption. Mercer wrote steadily. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, and all of them pointed at the places where the chain was thinnest, and he waited for the answers before writing anything further. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Mercer looked at his notepad, then at the documents she had laid out across his desk in sequence, then at Mara. "Your husband," he said. "You believe he was killed?" "Yes. You have no physical evidence of that?" "No." "Then for the purposes of this proceeding, until we have built enough to approach it from the other direction, we don't lead with it. Mara's jaw did the thing it did when she was controlling something. I understand. I'm not dismissing it," Mercer said. He said it without apology, but also without indifference. "I'm telling you what a courtroom requires and what it doesn't. What you have here," he gestured at the documents, "is a provable pattern of fraudulent land acquisition facilitated by a county official and enabled by a compromised judicial appointment. That is a case. That is a substantial case if we build it correctly." "What does building it correctly require?" Ethan asked. Mercer looked at him with the particular look of a man who is taking the measure of another man and is not concealed in the fact that he's doing it. "It requires that you don't move independently once we've committed to a strategy. It requires that you don't use your financial position to accelerate things that need to move at their own pace. and it requires that you understand that the moment this case becomes visible, the moment Harlan Cross figures out what we're doing, they will have three options. They can try to settle quietly, which would not be in their interest given how much exposure they have. They can try to discredit the evidence, which they will attempt regardless. Or they can try to stop this before it reaches a courtroom. Stop it how? Mara said. Mercer was quiet for a moment. These are men who have already, on the evidence available, been willing to do significant harm to protect their operation. I want you to be clear-eyed about that. I'm clear-eyed about it, Mara said. Thomas was clear-eyed about it too, and he tried to handle it alone, and it killed him. I'm not handling this alone. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he found in her expression, it was apparently sufficient. He made a note. The Briggs connection is our first priority. If we can establish the payment chain with original county records, not just FAR's summary, but the underlying documents, that's the foundation. Once Briggs is exposed, Cord becomes untenable. And once Cord falls, Harlan Cross loses their insurance on the judicial side, which makes every manufactured claim they've filed vulnerable. How do we get the original county records? Ethan asked. Briggs still has access to them. If he figures out someone is looking, he won't figure it out from this end, Mercer said. I have a contact in the Territorial Land Office in Helena who can request a jurisdictional audit of the county records without it originating at the county level. Briggs won't know what triggered it until we're ready for him to know. It was the first thing Mercer had said that Ethan had not already anticipated, and he felt the particular relief of finding that the man across the desk was actually as capable as his reputation suggested. Relief mixed with the slight discomfort of recognizing that he was going to need to trust someone else's judgment more than he was accustomed to trusting anyone's. The other landowners, Mara said. The ones who already lost their properties. If we build this case, can they be made whole? Mercer's considered it. Some of them, potentially. The legal theory would be fraudulent inducement that the settlements they signed were obtained through manufactured pressure, and therefore are voidable. It's not certain, and it would be a separate proceeding. But yes, if the pattern is established, it creates a foundation for challenging those prior settlements. Mara nodded once. It was the nod of someone who has been carrying a question and has received an answer that is not everything but is enough to keep going. What do we do in the meantime? Ethan said. You stay in Helena, both of you. Going back to Silver Creek now would alert Crow, alert Rolston, and give them a geographical advantage we don't need to give them. Are you able to remain here for the time required? Ethan said yes without hesitation. He had left Pete Gruber in charge of the ranch before Pete had been running cattle in Montana, since before Ethan was born and was not going to need guidance on anything that didn't involve a legal document. He sent Pete a message that afternoon, saying he would be in Helena for an extended period, and to contact him by telegraph if anything urgent arose. The waiting was the hard part. Not for Ethan, who had spent enough years of patient calculation to understand waiting as a tool rather than a failure. But Mara had been waiting for 14 months already, and waiting in Helena, with the shape of what they were doing, visible but not yet complete, had a particular texture that was different from waiting in Silver Creek, not knowing what came next. This was informed waiting, which ought to have been easier and in some ways was harder, because you could see exactly what needed to happen, and you could not make it happen faster. She kept working. She went through Thomas's papers again, more slowly this time, looking for things she might have missed the first or second time through. She found two things. The first was a partial name, a letter that Thomas had apparently received and kept, from which the Senza's name was smudged to illegibility. But the first initial was clear, H. Possibly Harmon Briggs, possibly not. But the letter's content was a veiled warning, framed in the language of a concerned acquaintance, suggesting that Thomas reconsider his position on the eastern parcel before the situation became more complicated than he could manage. The date on the letter was 8 weeks before Thomas died. The second thing she found was smaller and hurt more. It was a note in Thomas's handwriting, tucked into the back of a ledger that said, "Tell Mara about the copper when this is settled. Don't worry her before." She brought both things to Mercer. The letter was immediately useful. Mercer thought the partial initial, combined with the content and timing, could be linked to Briggs with sufficient supporting evidence. The note she showed him without comment, and he looked at it and handed it back to her without comment either, which was the right response. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket and did not take it out again. But she carried it everywhere after that. Ethan found out about the note 3 days later, not because she told him directly, but because he noticed it the way she would sometimes put her hand into her pocket without appearing to realize she was doing it, touching something inside. He did not ask about it. But 2 evenings later, sitting in Adele Fitch's small parlor after supper in the particular companionable quiet they had developed, for evenings in Helena, she took it out and set it on the table between them without explanation. He read it. He handed it back. He was trying to protect you, he said. I know. She folded it. I wish he hadn't, but I know. Both things can be true. Yes, she put it back in her pocket. Both things are true. The audit results began to arrive at Mercer's office at the end of the first week. It came in sections, which Mercer's contact had arranged, so that no single request looked significant enough to trigger attention. Mercer reviewed each section the day it arrived and briefed Ethan and Mara the following morning, which meant their days had a rhythm of anticipation and information that was both productive and difficult to sustain without fraying. What the audit found was worse than Farr's summary had indicated, because seeing the original documents, not a summary of them, but the actual records, the actual numbers, the actual dates made the scale of it concrete in a way that numbers on a second-hand report could not. Briggs had not just been taking payments. He had been actively manipulating the filing records, filing dates altered, ownership documentation misfiled in ways that would disadvantage landowners attempting to establish their legal standing, survey records for the Harlan Cross parcels prioritized and expedited, while competing claims languished. He had been doing it for at least 6 years. He had been thorough, and he had been careful, and he had been almost entirely invisible because the county land office was not a place that attracted scrutiny when things appeared to be functioning normally. And things had appeared to be functioning normally because Briggs had made sure they did. 6 years, Mara said, when Mercer laid it out for them. At minimum, Mercer said. The earliest transaction I can link directly to the manipulation is 6 years ago. There may be earlier instances we can't document because the records are too degraded. How many people, Ethan said. Across the full 6 years. I believe the number is closer to 15. The 7 Farr identified are the ones with the clearest paper trail. There are others where the manipulation is evident, but the connection to Harlan Cross is less direct. Mara was very still. 15 families. 15 parcels of land taken through a mechanism that was so quiet and so embedded in the ordinary machinery of county administration that none of those families had any way to see what was happening to them until they were already fighting, from a position that had been deliberately undermined. Thomas had seen it. Thomas had pulled the thread and had not gotten to the end of it in time. On the 8th day in Helena, the situation changed. It changed in the form of a message delivered to Adele Fitch's boarding house, addressed to Ethan Calloway, written in the formal language of a man who wished to be understood as reasonable. It was from Victor Rolston. He knew they were in Helena. He knew they were meeting with Mercer. He did not say how he knew, which meant Crow had been quicker to recover and communicate than Ethan had calculated, or that there was a second set of eyes somewhere that they had not accounted for. He proposed a meeting. He described himself in the letter as an intermediary who had been operating on incomplete information about the nature of his client's interests and who was prepared to discuss a resolution that would satisfy all parties. Ethan read it twice and handed it to Mara without comment. She read it once and set it down. He's scared. He's gathering information. He wants to know how much we have. He already knows we have enough, or he wouldn't have sent this. He knows we have something. He doesn't know how much. Ethan looked at the letter on the table between them. The question is whether there's anything useful in meeting him, or whether it gives him more than we get. What could we get? He might say something. Men like Rolston are good at the performance of reasonableness, and they're not always as careful in a conversation as they are on paper when they think they're controlling the tone. If he confirms something, he won't slip, Mara said. He's been doing this for years. He knows exactly where his lines are. Probably. Ethan paused, but he sent the letter, which means he's reacting to us rather than moving on his own schedule. That's already different from how this was supposed to go for him. She thought about it. We should tell Mercer before we do anything. Yes, Mercer's response when they brought him the letter that afternoon was immediate and unambiguous. Do not meet with Rolston. Do not respond to the letter. Any communication with opposing counsel at this stage creates legal risk and informational risk that outweighs any possible gain. Mercer would handle any required communications himself through proper channels. Ethan accepted this without the argument he might have made 2 weeks ago. Mara accepted it too, though he could see that she found it harder. She wanted to be in the room. She had been wanting to be in the room with Victor Rolston since the day he had walked into her house and swept Thomas's papers off her table and let them fall to the floor like garbage, and the strategic prohibition against it did not make the wanting go away. Soon, Ethan said later, when they were walking back from Mercer's office in the early dark, I know, she said, I know the strategy. I understand why. But I want to look him in the face when he realizes it didn't work. She said it without particular heat, not rage, not drama. Just a plain statement of something she had been carrying for a long time, and had given up trying to make smaller than it was. I want him to know that the widow he walked in on was not what he thought she was, that none of it was what he thought it was. Ethan walked beside her through the cold Helena evening, their breath visible in the air, the lights of the town coming on around them in the early dark. "You'll get that," he said. "It just won't be in a private meeting where he controls the room." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where will it be?" "In a courtroom," he said, "where the record is permanent." She looked at him sidelong. Something in her expression shifted, not softness exactly, but the particular look of someone who has heard the right answer and is taking a moment to let it settle into its proper place. They walked the rest of the way back in the quiet that had become their most reliable language with each other, the one that didn't require anything from either of them, that simply held the space between two people who had come a long way from a mountain cabin and a second plate on a table, and were not finished yet, not by a long distance, but were moving in the right direction. Behind them, somewhere in Helena, Victor Rolston was waiting for a reply that was not going to come. And in Mercer's office, the audit records were stacked in the order they would need to be presented, and the chain was holding, and the case that Thomas Ellison had started pulling at with his annotated map and his careful notes and his refusal to sell what was his, that case was becoming real. It was not finished. There were pieces still moving that none of them could fully see yet, and the men at the center of the Harlan Cross Syndicate had not yet decided how far they were willing to go to protect what they had built. But the window that had started as a widow sitting alone in a house with a trunk full of papers, and no one beside her, had become something that none of them, not Rolston, not the syndicate, not Silas Crow in his rented room, had anticipated when they had set this machine running 6 years ago. It had become a door, and on the other side of it, the truth about what had happened in this corner of Montana was waiting to be named in a room where the naming of it would count. Rolston's letter sat unanswered for 4 days, which was itself a kind of answer. And on the 5th day, a second letter arrived at Adelphich's boarding house that made it clear the unanswered first one had been noted and interpreted correctly. This second letter was different in tone. The careful language of reasonableness was still there, but underneath it, visible the way, structural damage is visible in a wall that has been painted over, the pressure had changed. Rolston wrote that he was authorized by his clients to make a formal settlement offer. He named a figure. It was, Ethan noted, significantly larger than the manufactured debt he had originally threatened Mara with, which told him 2 things. The syndicate knew the situation had moved past the original script, and they had decided that paying to make it go away was preferable to whatever they thought was coming. They were not wrong about what was coming. They were wrong about whether paying would stop it. Mercer read the letter at his desk while Ethan and Mara sat across from him, and when he finished, he set it down with the particular expression of a man who has seen this move before and has a ready counter for it. "They're trying to close the window," he said. "They know the audit is happening, or they suspect it. This offer is designed to get Mara to sign something that includes a non-disclosure agreement, which would make the evidence she's carrying legally unusable in any subsequent proceeding. It would protect them even if the audit turns up what we think it will," Ethan said. "It would complicate matters significantly, yes." Mercer looked at Mara. "The decision is yours. The offer is real money, more than the land itself would generate in the near term." Mara looked at the letter. She did not pick it up. "What happens to the other 15 families if I sign?" Mercer was quiet for a moment. The case against the syndicate's broader operation becomes substantially harder to build. Not impossible, but harder. You were the entry point, your evidence, your land, your husband's documentation. Without your cooperation, what's left is Farr's analysis and the audit, which are suggestive, but not anchored to a specific victim who is willing to testify. "So they walk," Mara said. "They would likely survive in a diminished form, yes. They would not be able to continue operating in this county with the same impunity. But the broader pattern, the 15 families, the 6 years would be very difficult to address without you." She was quiet. Ethan watched her and said nothing, because this was not a moment for him to say anything. She had made it clear, in the weeks since Silver Creek, that she knew her own mind, and that having it confirmed by someone else was not the same as making it up. She needed to arrive at this herself. She picked up the letter, looked at it for a moment, and set it back down. "Tell them no." Mercer nodded once. He made a note. "I'll draft the formal rejection this afternoon. I'll also use the response to signal that we're prepared to proceed, which will give them a clearer picture of where we stand. That will accelerate things." "How much?" Ethan asked. "Days, not weeks. Once they understand the settlement isn't going to work, they'll move to their next option." He paused. "I want to move first, which means we need to file before they do. How close are we?" "The audit gave us what we needed on Briggs. The payment records are clear, and the documentation of the filing manipulations is extensive enough to constitute a criminal referral, not just a civil matter." The cord connection is more delicate. Judicial corruption is a different category and requires a different standard, but I have enough to bring it to the territorial prosecutor's attention as a parallel matter. He looked at both of them. What I need before we file is a sworn statement from Mara about Thomas's refused offers, the warning letter, his notes. Everything she has direct knowledge of. That goes into the filing as exhibit support. When? Mara said. Tomorrow morning. I'll have my clerk prepare the forms tonight. They walked back to Adele's in the early dark again. The same route they had been taking for 10 days now. Familiar enough that Ethan had stopped noticing the individual buildings and had started noticing instead the way the temperature changed at certain corners where the wind came through, the way the gas lamps created pools of yellow light with cold dark between them. Helena at night was not a quiet place, but it had rhythms, and he had learned some of them. Mara walked with her hands in her coat pockets, the one on the left closed around the folded note in Thomas's handwriting. He had started to recognize the gesture the way she reached for it, without being aware she was doing it. The way it had become a kind of ballast for her, something to hold when the weight of things shifted. Tomorrow, she said, not quite to him and not quite to herself. Tomorrow, he agreed. I've been carrying his papers for 14 months. She was not looking for a response. She was thinking out loud. Every time I read them, I found something I hadn't seen the time before, some new piece of what he knew and didn't tell me. At first, that made me angry. Then I just missed him. Now I think he would have done exactly what we're doing. He would have gone further, maybe. He would have been worse at taking Mercer's direction than either of us. Ethan almost smiled. Worse than me? Much worse than you. Thomas had very strong opinions about how things should be done, and not a lot of patience for being told otherwise. Sounds difficult to live with. He was, she said. A pause. Something in her voice had the complicated quality of truth that contains multiple contradictory things. He was also the best person I knew. The two things were not unrelated. They walked a block without speaking. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, your wife. You don't talk about her. He had been expecting this question for some time, which did not make it easier to receive. No, he said. You don't have to. I know. He thought about how to say it accurately, which was the only standard he was trying to meet. Her name was Clara. She died 7 years ago, the child a boy 3 days old. He didn't to survive either. He said it the way you say things you have said inside your own head so many times that the words have worn smooth, not because it doesn't hurt, but because the hurt has found a shape that can be carried. After that, I went to the mountain. I told myself it was because I needed quiet. I told myself a lot of things. What was the true thing? He thought about it. That I had no idea how to be in the world anymore, and the mountain required nothing from me. The cattle required things, but those were practical things. Things I could do with my body and my money and my knowledge. Nobody on a cattle ranch asks you how you're doing and expects an honest answer. Nobody in Silver Creek does either, Mara said. No, Thomas asked. It was one of the things about him that could be infuriating. He would look at you and ask how you were doing and wait for the actual answer, not the socially acceptable one. She paused. I think that's part of why they considered him a problem. Men who pay attention are inconvenient. Ethan looked at the road ahead. The boarding house was half a block away, its windows lit against the dark. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was, she said simply. They reached Adele's door and stopped for a moment in the cold on the front step, not quite ready to go inside, in the way that people sometimes linger at the end of conversations that have gone somewhere real. Ethan, she said. He looked at her. Thank you. For not managing this for me. For letting me drive it. He thought about all the moments in the past weeks when he had wanted to accelerate, to use money or position to move things faster, and had held back because she had asked him to consult her first, and how almost every time he had held back, the slower path had turned out to be the right one. You were right more often than I was, he said. It seemed practical to let you lead. That's a very unsentimental way to put it. I'm an unsentimental man. She looked at him with the expression he still found difficult to read, the one that was something she was deciding whether to say or not. Then she said, no, you're not. You're a man who decided to be unsentimental because it was safer. There's a difference. She went inside before he had an answer. He stood on the front step for a moment in the cold, watching his breath in the air, and then went inside too. The sworn statement took most of the following morning. Mercer's clerk was thorough and patient, and Mara was precise and complete, which made it take longer than it might have with a less careful witness, every detail verified, every date cross-referenced against the documents, every assertion grounded in what she had direct knowledge of versus what she had inferred. When she described Thomas's refusal of the 2 offers, her voice did not change. When she described the morning she had been told about the accident, her voice did not change then either. And Ethan watched Mercer's clerk watch her, and understood that the clerk was noting the steadiness of it, recognizing that this was not a witness who could be characterized as unstable or emotional, or driven by grief rather than fact. She was both of those things. She was also something beyond them, and the distinction was visible to anyone paying attention. When it was done and the pages were signed, Mercer took the statement and added it to the filing stack with the same brisk efficiency with which he handled everything. And then he looked up at both of them across his desk. "We file this afternoon," he said. "Once it's filed, it's public record. Harlan Cross will know within 24 hours. Rolston will know sooner." He paused. "I want you both to understand what that means practically. Up to now, we have been building something they couldn't see clearly. Once this is filed, they can see all of it. And men who have built what these men have built, over six years, with this much at stake, they will react." "We've been over this," Ethan said. "I know, I'm saying it again because saying it once is not sufficient for something this serious." Mercer set his pen down. He looked at both of them with the particular directness of a man who has lost something before by underestimating what the other side was willing to do. "Stay together. Don't go anywhere separately that you haven't told me about. If anyone approaches you, anyone, not just Rolston, you come to me before you respond." Mara said, "What about Crow? What about him?" "He's here. He followed us or got here ahead of us. I'm not sure which. I've seen him twice in the past 4 days. He's not trying to hide anymore." Mercer absorbed that. He shifted from intelligence gathering to monitoring. That's consistent with the syndicate moving to their next phase. He made a note. "I'll speak to a colleague who has a relationship with the Territorial Marshal's office. I can't promise anything there, but I want it noted that we have a known operative in Helena following parties to an active legal filing." Ethan looked at Mara. She looked back at him. The information about Crow was not news to either of them. They had both noticed him, had both said nothing about it to the other, until now in what he recognized as a mutual unspoken decision not to amplify the anxiety of the waiting period. Now that the filing was happening, there was no reason not to name it. "He's a professional," Ethan said. "He watches. That's his function." "As long as that's all he does," Mara said. "If his function changes, we'll know." The filing happened at 2 in the afternoon at the Territorial Court Clerk's office, delivered by Mercer's clerk, with Mercer himself in attendance. It was not a dramatic event in its external form papers handed across a counter, a stamp, a receipt, a copy retained. It was the same procedure that happened dozens of times a day in that office with papers of varying significance. The clerk gave no indication of recognizing anything unusual about this particular stack, which was as it should be. But the papers were public record now, and public records, in a territory where information moved through telegraph lines and word of mouth, and the careful attention of men whose job it was to monitor certain channels, did not stay unnoticed for long. The first indication that the filing had been received in the manner Mercer had anticipated came that same evening. Ethan was in the small sitting room at Adele's when Pete Gruber's message arrived, forwarded through the ranch telegraph to Helena, terse and practical in Pete's way, saying that 2 men had arrived at the main ranch property that afternoon, well-dressed and unannounced, and had asked to speak with Ethan. Pete had told them Ethan was away on business, and he did not know when he would return. The men had left without leaving names. Pete had noted the horses they were riding and the direction they had gone. Ethan read the message and went to find Mara. She was in her room with Thomas's papers spread on the bed, going through them one more time with the particular restlessness that came over her when she needed to do something, and there was nothing to do yet. She looked up when he knocked and came in, and she read the expression on his face before he handed her the message. "Your ranch," she said after reading it. "They're making sure I understand that they have reach, that this isn't limited to Helena or Silver Creek." He sat in the chair by the window. "It's pressure. They're not going to do anything to the property that's a legal exposure they can't afford right now. But they want me to know they know where everything is. Does it change anything?" He thought about it honestly. "No. Pete can handle whatever comes at the ranch level, and I knew when we filed that they would push back." He looked at her. "Does it worry you? About going back? Going back to Silver Creek? Eventually, when this is resolved, you'd be going back to a place where Harlan Cross had people, where Briggs had been operating for 6 years, where the whole community watched what happened to you and made their calculations about which way it was going to go." Mara set the papers down. "You're asking whether I'm afraid of what Silver Creek thinks of me. I'm asking whether you've thought about it." "Every day," she said. "And yes, I've thought about going back. What I have there, Thomas's house, the land when this is done, the people who knew him, that's not nothing. Roy Callister is not nothing. The people who were kind during the hard months are not nothing." She paused. "The people who made their calculations and chose not to be kind, I can live with that. I've lived with harder." He nodded slowly. "When Pete sent back the note about the men at the ranch, my first instinct was to ride back. Handle it myself, be present. Your instinct is always to handle things yourself." "Yes, it's a character flaw I'm aware of." "The second instinct?" He was quiet for a moment. "That Pete has it. That the ranch will be fine. That the thing that needs me present is here, not there." He paused. That was a harder instinct to trust. She looked at him with the careful attention she gave to things she was taking seriously. You're learning slowly. Most things worth learning happen slowly, she said. The ones that happen fast usually leave marks. He thought about Clara, about the mountain, about 6 years of deliberate aloneness that he had decided was a choice, and which had turned out to be, on examination, more like a scar that had stiffened into something he mistook for a preference. Yes, he said. They do. The next morning brought Mercer to Adele's door before breakfast, which was outside his usual pattern, and told Ethan immediately that something had developed. Mercer came in without ceremony and accepted Adele's coffee with a distracted efficiency and put a document on the table in the dining room. Cords, he said. Ethan looked at the document. It was a letter on territorial court stationery, addressed to Mercer's office, from Judge Elias Cord. It was written in the formal language of someone who had spent decades in the law and knew exactly how to use precision of language as a shield. But underneath the formality, the content was remarkable. Cord was requesting a meeting. He was requesting it, he wrote, in order to discuss matters of mutual interest relating to ongoing territorial land proceedings. Mara came in from the kitchen with her own coffee and read the letter over Ethan's shoulder. He's scared, she said. The same thing she had said about Ralston. But this was different, and she knew it. He's more scared than Ralston. He should be, Mercer said. Ralston is an attorney for hire. His exposure is professional and potentially criminal, but he has resources and he has options. Cord is a sitting judge. If what we have on him reaches the territorial prosecutor, he loses everything. The bench is standing, likely his freedom. He sat down across from them. The question is whether a frightened man on the bench is more useful to us or more dangerous. Meeting him seems obvious, Ethan said. It has risks. Whatever he tells us in a private meeting has limited legal weight unless we have it documented in a way that's admissible. He knows that. He'll be careful. Mercer wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. He had the look of a man who had been up early with a problem and had arrived at a conclusion he was not entirely comfortable with. What I want to do is have you both in the meeting. Not me, a judge won't negotiate openly with opposing counsel. But if Cord is willing to talk to Ethan Calloway informally, as one prominent Montana figure to another, with Mara present as the affected party, he might say something he wouldn't say to me. You want us to draw him out, Mara said. I want you to give him a room where he thinks he can speak freely and where he will underestimate the two of you. Because men like Cord always underestimate people who don't have a law degree. He paused. I'll be close. I'll have my clerk in a position to document what he says, if he says anything usable. And if he doesn't say anything usable, Ethan said, then we lose an afternoon and we continue with what we have. The filing is already made. Cord doesn't stop it by meeting with us. He only helps himself, or doesn't. Mara was looking at the letter. He chose to reach out. He made the first move. He must have calculated that whatever he tells us is less dangerous than whatever he thinks we already have. Which tells us something, Ethan said. It tells us the audit results got back to him faster than we thought. Briggs must have warned him. Mercer nodded. Which means Briggs knows. Which means the clock on Briggs taking action to protect himself is running. He set down the cup. We need to be quick. The meeting with Cord was arranged for the following afternoon at a hotel on the south side of Helena. That was not the one Ralston was staying at, and not the one that anyone connected to the syndicate had been seen near. Mercer selected it with the attention to detail that characterized everything he did. 3 exits from the main meeting room, a clerk stationed in the adjacent parlor with a full view of the door, and Mercer himself in the hotel's small reading room with a direct line of sight to the lobby. Cord arrived 4 minutes early, which Ethan noted as the behavior of a man who wanted to establish himself in the room before the other parties arrived, and which failed because Ethan and Mara were already there when he came in. He was in his late 60s, heavier than Ethan had imagined from the name, with the careful grooming of a man who took his public presentation seriously, and the slightly uncertain quality around the eyes of someone who had not slept well. He looked at both of them. He looked longest at Mara. Mrs. Ellison, he said. His voice was practiced, modulated, reassuring, the voice of a courtroom. But it had a thread of something tight in it. Judge Cord, she said. She did not add anything to that. They sat. Cord ordered nothing from the hotel staff, who came and went quickly. He placed his hands on the table in front of him, in the posture of a man who was trying to appear relaxed, and was not. I understand you've made a filing, he said, addressing Ethan, on Mrs. Ellison's behalf. Through our attorney, Ethan said. Samuel Mercer. I know Mercer's work. Cord paused. He is thorough. He is. Another pause. Cord appeared to be making a decision. Ethan could see it happening, the internal weighing, the calculation of what to say and how much to say, and what version of saying it carried the least exposure. I want you to understand, Cord said finally, that my involvement with certain matters was more limited than it may appear. What matters? Mara said. He looked at her. The look had the quality of a man who had come in expecting to manage a conversation, and was discovering that the management was more complicated than anticipated. The land proceedings that have come through my court over the past several years. Certain of those proceedings I was given information that led me to believe the legal basis for the claims was sound. I was not made fully aware of the methods by which the underlying pressure was applied. Ethan watched him. The careful language was doing exactly what Mara had predicted. Cord was trying to construct a version of events in which he was a secondary figure rather than a participant. He was looking for the outline of a defense and trying to draw it in this room with these witnesses before he had to draw it in a formal one. You ruled in favor of the claimant in 5 consecutive cases involving the same purchasing entity, Ethan said. Not accusatory. Just a statement of what the record showed. The cases were presented to me with what appeared to be sound legal documentation. Documentation that Harmon Briggs processed and filed, Mara said. A slight change in Cord's posture. Not visible to someone who wasn't watching for it, but Ethan was watching for it. I was not in a position to independently verify the county filing procedures, Cord said. Were you aware of the payments made to Briggs by the survey company? Ethan said. Cord's hands shifted on the table. I was not involved in any financial arrangement with anyone connected to these proceedings. That's not what I asked. The room went quiet for a moment. Cord looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the person across the table is not what he had assessed them to be. He had come in expecting a wealthy rancher who would respond to the language of mutual understanding, the coded dialogue of men of position who were both invested in keeping things manageable. He had not expected precision. Mara leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to bring herself into the center of Cord's attention in a way he clearly had not anticipated. My husband tried to use the county filing system to document what was happening to his land. His filings were delayed and misfiled and buried under paperwork that didn't reflect what he had actually submitted. That manipulation went through Briggs's office. When he pursued it further, he died. She paused. You presided over 3 of the cases that were processed using the manipulated filings. I'm asking you whether you knew what the filings had been through before they reached your courtroom. Cord was very still. The silence lasted long enough that it became itself a form of answer. I became aware, he said, very carefully, that certain procedural irregularities existed. I was advised that they had been corrected. Advised by whom? Another silence. By a representative of the interests that were bringing the claims, he said. Mara sat back. She did not say anything. She did not need to. What Cord had just said, hedged and qualified and armored in every way he knew, how was that he had known the filings were irregular, had been told by the opposing party that the irregularities were corrected, and had chosen to take that word rather than investigate, which was not the same as direct corruption, but was close enough to it that the distinction would not hold up to serious scrutiny. Ethan looked at Cord. What is it you wanted from this meeting? Cord was quiet for a moment. The practiced composure had thinned considerably. Underneath it was something that looked like a man who had spent years telling himself that what he was doing was, in some interpretable frame, acceptable, and who was now in a room where that frame was being taken apart piece by piece. I wanted to understand the scope of the proceedings, he said. You wanted to know what we have, Ethan said. Yes. We have the audit records. We have the payment documentation on Briggs. We have the pattern across 15 landowners and 6 years. We have Thomas Ellison's survey notes and his refused offers and the timeline of his death. Ethan said it without emphasis, the way you state facts that don't require decoration. And we now have this conversation. Cord looked at the table. Something had changed in his face. The careful architecture of composure had given way, not completely but noticeably, to something that was simply the face of a man who had made choices and was now sitting across from their consequences. If I were to provide a sworn statement, Cord said slowly, regarding my interactions with representatives of the claimant interests regarding what I was told and what I knew, that's a conversation you need to have with your own attorney, Ethan said. Not with us, Cord looked up. But I'd suggest, Ethan continued, that you have it quickly. They left Cord at the table with his hands still flat in front of him, and the hotel staff moving at a careful distance around the edges of the room. And they walked out into the cold afternoon and did not speak until they were half a block from the hotel. And then Mara stopped walking and stood for a moment, with her face turned slightly up toward the winter sky in the way she sometimes did when she needed to let something settle. He's going to cooperate, she said. Probably. When a man starts talking about a sworn statement in his opening gambit, he's already decided. Ethan stopped beside her. It means the syndicate loses their judicial protection. It means every ruling Cord made in their favor is suddenly open to challenge. It means the other landowners have a path, yes. She was quiet for another moment. The sky was the flat white of a Montana winter afternoon, neither beautiful nor threatening, just present. Then she said, Thomas never got to sit across from any of them. He pulled the thread and didn't get to see where it led. Ethan did not offer anything to smooth that over, because there was nothing that would. He got it started, he said finally, the map, the notes, the refusal. Without those, there's nothing to build on. I know, she started walking again. I just want him to have known that it worked. They were back at Mercer's office within the hour, and the debrief was thorough and efficient and ended with Mercer in the particular focused state of a man who can see the end game and is calculating the fastest path to it. Cord's potential cooperation, if it materialized into a sworn statement, shifted the entire legal landscape. It moved the proceeding from a civil challenge to the manufactured debt claim into the territory of a full criminal investigation into the syndicate's operations, involving the territorial prosecutor's office, potentially the Federal Land Commission, and every case that had passed through Cord's courtroom in the past 6 years. Rolston will know about the meeting before morning, Mercer said. Cord will tell him either directly or through the syndicate's people. He's not trustworthy in the conventional sense. He's acting in his own interest, which right now aligns with ours but could shift. So we need to move before he decides his interest has shifted, Ethan said. The territorial prosecutor's office. I have a meeting set for tomorrow morning. I was going to go alone, but I want Mara there. He looked at her. You are the primary witness. The prosecutor needs to see you. Not your statement on paper, you, in the room. The way you presented to Cord today is the way you need to present tomorrow. What does that mean? Mara asked. It means exactly what you did today. You don't soften it. You don't apologize for it. You don't try to make it easier for them to hear. You tell them what happened the way it happened, and you let them sit with it the way it is. She nodded once. And the syndicate's representative? Ethan said. They have someone in Helena, whoever Rolston reports to. When they figure out that Cord is moving toward cooperation and that the prosecutor is involved, they'll try one more thing before they fold, Mercer said. That's the pattern. They always try one more thing. He said it with a flat certainty of experience, and neither Ethan nor Mara asked him to elaborate, because they had both been in this long enough to understand that the one more thing was the part you could not fully predict. You could build your case and shore up your witnesses, and file your documents and brief your prosecutor, and still arrive at the moment where your side made a move that you had not fully accounted for, because desperate men are not predictable in the way that confident ones are. That night, back at Adele's, Ethan sat at the small desk in his room and wrote a long message to Pete Gruber that covered every contingency he could think of related to the ranch, and when he was done writing it, he realized that what he had actually been doing was making sure that if something went wrong, Pete had what he needed to keep things running. The thought sat with him uncomfortably for a while, and then he put it away, because there was nothing practical to be done with it, and dwelling was not a habit he had ever found useful. He went and knocked on Mara's door. She opened it quickly, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. She looked at him in the lamplit hallway, with the expression that had become familiar, the one that wasn't soft exactly, but wasn't guarded either. That middle place she occupied when the day had taken something from her, but she was still upright. I'm not going to be able to sleep, she said. No, he agreed. Neither am I. Come in. The room was small. The lamp on the table turned low. Thomas's papers in their organized stack on the bed where she had apparently been reviewing them again. She cleared a space and sat on the edge of the bed, and he took the chair, and they stayed like that for a while, not talking, in the way that had become their most reliable way of being in the same room, when there was nothing left to plan and nothing left to say, and the night was simply something to get through. After a while she said, when this is over, yes. I don't know what that looks like yet. No, he said. Neither do I. That used to frighten me. Not knowing. She looked at her hands. 14 months ago, I could not have imagined anything past the next week, the week after Thomas. The only thing that moved me forward was the next thing that needed to be done. Is that different now? She thought about it for a long moment. I can see past the next week. That's different. A pause. I can see the land. After this, it'll be mine. Actually mine. Without a manufactured debt on it. Without men in suits deciding what to do with it. I can see that. She looked up at him. I can see other things too. I'm not sure what to do about those yet. He held her gaze. Neither am I, he said, but I'm not in a hurry. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she nodded. Once, the way she nodded when something had been said that needed to be said and didn't require anything added to it. And then she reached over and picked up the top paper from the stack on the bed. Thomas's hand-drawn map, the one with copper circled twice, and held it in her lap, and looked at it quietly. And Ethan sat in the chair by the window and let the night pass around them, and neither of them was alone in it. Somewhere across Helena, Victor Rolston was in his hotel room, with the news of the afternoon's meeting, reaching him through whatever channels he used, and the careful architecture of his plan was showing its first real fractures. And in an office somewhere that Ethan could not see, The Harlan Cross Syndicate was deciding what its one more thing was going to be. But in Adele Fitch's boarding house, in a small lamp-lit room with Thomas Ellison's careful handwriting spread across a bed, there was something that the men with money and plans and 6 years of practice had not built into their calculations. Two people who had stopped running. And the morning was coming. The morning came the way Ethan had known it, would not gently, not with any particular announcement. Just the gray light finding the edges of the curtains and the sound of Helena beginning its day in the street below, horses and wagon wheels and the distant clang of something metallic from the direction of the rail yard. He had slept perhaps 3 hours. He dressed in the dark and went downstairs and found Mara already in Adele's kitchen sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and Thomas's map folded in front of her. Not open. Just there. She looked up when he came in and he could see from the quality of her eyes that she had slept about as well as he had, which was to say barely, which was to say that what had kept her awake had been the same thing keeping him awake, not fear exactly, but the particular vigilance that comes when you are close enough to something that matters that you cannot afford to stop paying attention to it, even in sleep. Adele came in from the back with bread already sliced and set it on the table without comment. She had the manner of a woman who had been running a boarding house long enough to know when her guests needed feeding and when they needed talking to, and which of those two things was more useful in a given moment. This was a feeding moment. She left the bread and went back out. They ate without much conversation. The prosecutor's meeting was at 9. It was now just past 7. Mercer had said he would meet them at his office at 8:30, which left time for the breakfast and the walk, and whatever the walk contained. "Did you sleep?" Mara asked. "Some, me too, some." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I keep thinking about the other families, the ones we haven't met, the ones who lost their land and don't know yet that any of this is happening. Mercer said some of them will be contacted once the prosecutor's investigation opens formally." I know what Mercer said. A pause. "I'm thinking about what it's like to not know, to have lost something and had no explanation for it, and gone on living with the weight of that not knowing. I lived with it for 14 months. Mine was about Thomas. Theirs is about land and livelihoods, and she stopped. It's a different kind of grief. But it's grief." He thought about that. "When this opens up, it's going to be in the newspapers. Helena papers first, then probably territory-wide. Those families will know before Mercer gets around to contacting them directly. That's not a clean way to find out." "No," he said. "It's not. But it's how things move. The clean way takes longer, and the longer it takes, the more time the syndicate has to reposition itself." He set his cup down. "There is no version of this that doesn't leave some damage." She looked at him. "You used to try to make things clean with money." "I used to think I could." "What changed?" He thought about the honest answer, which was not a single thing but several things laid on top of each other. "I stopped being alone long enough to see how other people move through problems," he said. "You don't use money to solve things. You use what you have, and you accept what you can't fix, and you keep going." I'd forgotten what that looked like. She held his gaze for a moment. "Thomas used to say that watching how a person handles something they can't buy their way out of tells you more about them than anything else." He was right, he was. She picked up the folded map and put it in her coat pocket alongside the note. She had been carrying both of them for weeks now. He had stopped thinking of them as documents and started thinking of them as the things they actually were, a dead man's evidence and a dead man's apology, and the woman carrying them had made peace with both in her own way and in her own time, which was not a thing anyone could have done for her. They left Adele's at 8 and walked to Mercer's office through a morning that had turned sharper overnight, the cold with a cutting edge that had not been there the day before. Helena looked businesslike in the early light, the kind of town that woke up with intention. They walked without hurrying, because hurrying would not make 9 o'clock arrive faster, and because Ethan had found, in the weeks since Silver Creek, that walking beside Mara Ellison in silence was one of the more comfortable things in his current life, which was an observation he had not shared with her, and was not sure he needed to. Mercer was already at his desk when they arrived, which was not surprising. He briefed them for 20 minutes, covering what the prosecutor, a man named Gerald Haste, who Mercer described as careful and ambitious in approximately equal measure, was likely to want to establish, what he was likely to push on, and what they should not volunteer unless asked. He looked at Mara specifically when he said that last part. "I know," she said before he finished. "I'm saying it anyway." "You always say things twice," she said, not unkindly. "I've noticed." Mercer almost smiled. It was a brief thing more visible in the eyes than the mouth, and it was gone quickly. "It's a professional habit. People hear things better the second time." "I heard you the first time," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I almost didn't say it the second time." They walked to the territorial prosecutor's building together, the three of them, and the walk had the quality of something that had been building for weeks and was now arriving at its practical center. Ethan had been in rooms with powerful men before cattlemen's associations, bank meetings, the water rights lawsuit years ago. He knew how those rooms worked and how the men in them positioned themselves and what they actually wanted versus what they said they wanted. He was not anxious about Gerald Haste. He realized, anxious about Mara. Not because he doubted her, he had stopped doubting her somewhere around the second week in Helena, if he was honest about it, but because what she was going to be asked to do in that room was the hardest version of what she had been doing for 14 months, which was to carry the full weight of Thomas Ellison's death into a space that would assess its legal utility, and he was not sure what that cost her in ways she did not show. He didn't say any of this. There was no way to say it that wouldn't sound like he was questioning her readiness, which was not what it was. It was something more like the particular concern of a person who has started to care about what things cost someone else, which was a faculty he had not exercised in a long time, and which still felt imprecise in his hands, like a tool he had put down years ago and was only now relearning the grip of. Gerald Haste was younger than Ethan had expected, mid-40s, lean, with the slightly distracted quality of a man who was always partly thinking about three other things. He shook hands efficiently, gestured toward the chairs, and sat down, and looked at the filing documents that Mercer's had sent ahead, which were already open on his desk with notations in the margins. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, looking at Mara, "I've reviewed the filing and Mr. Mercer's summary. I want to hear it from you directly. Start with the first refused offer." She started there. She spoke for 40 minutes as she had in Mercer's office 2 weeks before, but this was not the same as that. This had a different texture because Haste interrupted. Not rudely, but precisely, at the moments where the chain needed to be tighter, asking the questions that tested the weakest links. "How do you know the offer came directly from the syndicate and not through a secondary party? What is your evidence that Briggs had access to Thomas's specific filings as opposed to general county records? When you say the timing of Thomas's death was suspicious, what specific facts support that characterization beyond the general improbability of the accident?" She answered every question. Not always with a clean answer, because some of the questions were pointed at places where what they had was inference layered over circumstantial evidence rather than direct documentation, and she said so plainly rather than overstating what the record could support. Which was, Ethan observed, exactly the right approach. Haste was testing for the quality of the witness as much as the quality of the evidence, and a witness who admitted the limits of what they knew was more credible than one who claimed certainty about everything. When she finished, Haste looked at his notes for a moment. "Judge Cord," he said, "you met with him yesterday." "Yes," Mara said. "His statement, as described in your attorney's summary, that he became aware of procedural irregularities and was advised by the claimant's representative that they had been corrected. You heard that personally?" "I was in the room and Mr. Calloway." "Yes," Ethan said. Haste made a note. He looked at Mercer. "Cord has until noon today to decide whether he's providing a formal cooperation statement. I spoke with his personal attorney this morning." Mercer did not look surprised. "What's the indication that he will?" Haste paused. His attorney is experienced enough to know what the alternative looks like. He set down his pen. "I want to be clear about what happens next. The moment I open a formal investigation, this moves out of the civil proceeding entirely and into criminal territory. Harlan Cross will have notice within hours. Rolston will attempt to file a motion to stay the civil proceedings pending resolution of the criminal matter, which is a standard delaying tactic that Mercer will be prepared to counter." "And Briggs?" Ethan said. "Briggs is going to be arrested by the end of the week. The audit records are sufficient for a criminal charge on the filing manipulation alone. The payment documentation adds financial fraud." Haste looked at his notes. "He may also cooperate. Men in his position often do when they understand the scope of what they're facing. And if he cooperates," Mara said, "he tells them about Thomas." The room went quiet. Haste looked at her carefully. "What Briggs knows about Thomas Ellison's death is something we don't fully know yet. But yes, if Briggs was in communication with the syndicate during the period leading up to your husband's death, that communication becomes part of the investigation." "Will it be enough," she said, "to prove what happened to him?" Haste was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who did not give people the answer they wanted when the honest answer was different, which was a quality Ethan respected even when it was uncomfortable. "I don't know yet," he said. "What I know is that the investigation will go there. Whether the evidence takes us where you believe it will, I can't promise that." Mara received that without flinching. "I know you can't promise it," she said. "I'm asking if you'll look." "I will look," he said, and said it in a way that meant it. They left the prosecutor's building at just past 11 in the morning, stepping back out into the sharp cold, and stood for a moment on the front step in the way they had been standing on steps at the end of significant things throughout this whole Helena period. Mercer said, "Cord will cooperate. The investigation will open. The civil proceeding on your land claim is effectively over with the criminal investigation opening. No court is going to enforce a manufactured debt that is part of a fraud investigation. So the land is safe, Ethan said. The land is safe, Mercer confirmed. He said it simply, without fanfare, because he was not a fanfare kind of man, and because the thing that needed to be said next was harder. The broader case, the other landowners. What happened to Thomas that is going to take time? Months, possibly longer. I want you both to understand that. We understand, Mara said. Mercer nodded. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite the careful professional distance he usually maintained, something that had come forward in it, briefly. You built this case, he said. 14 months of keeping those papers. That's not nothing. Most people don't hold on that long. She looked at him. I didn't have anywhere to put them down. He accepted that. He shook their hands and went back inside, already thinking about the next thing, because that was how Mercer moved through the world. Ethan and Mara stood in the cold for a moment. It's over, she said. Not triumphantly. Not even with particular relief yet. Just registering it. The acute party said.
Yes.
She turned and looked at him. What happens to you when we go back? It was a question he had been thinking about without quite formulating it. What do you mean? You've been here. Away from the ranch, away from Silver Creek, away from your mountain. For weeks you've been living in someone else's boarding house, fighting a problem that wasn't originally yours. She looked at him steadily. You came into this because of me. What does it look like for you when we go back? He thought about it the way he thought about things he needed to say accurately. I go back to the ranch, he said. I check on the North Pasture water situation, which Pete has been managing but which I should handle before spring. Right up to the cabin, he paused. And I figure out what comes next from there. That's not really an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. He looked at her. What I know is that I don't want to go back to the cabin the way I went back to it before. As a place to stop having to deal with things. What do you want it to be? I'd like it to be a place I go because I want to be there. Not because I'm avoiding everything else. He paused. That's a different relationship with it than I've had for 6 years. She was quiet for a moment, watching the street. When I left Silver Creek, I thought I might not go back. There was a night, early in those first months after Thomas, when I thought about leaving, starting somewhere with no one who knew me, where nobody looked at me with that careful expression people use with widows, like you're made of something fragile. Why didn't you? Because running felt like giving them something, like letting the weight of it chase me out of a place where I had a life. She turned back to him. I stayed because leaving felt like losing something in addition to what I'd already lost. And now? Now I want to go back because it's mine. The land is mine. The history there is mine, the hard parts and the good parts both. I want to go back on my own terms, she paused, which is different from how I left. He nodded slowly. It was the thing she had been building toward for months, not just the legal outcome, not just the land secured, but the internal geography of it. The difference between surviving a place and belonging to it. The one more thing that Mercer had predicted came 2 days later, and it was not what either of them had anticipated, which was perhaps the point. It did not come from Rolston. It did not come from Crow, who had disappeared from Helena sometime in the previous 48 hours, a disappearance that Mercer's contact at the marshal's office interpreted as the syndicate pulling its local operative back before he became legally exposed. It came in the form of a man who knocked on Adele Fitch's front door at 7 in the evening and asked for Ethan Calloway by name. Adele, who was nobody's fool, told the man to wait on the porch and came to find Ethan first. She described him, 50s, expensive coat, the kind of posture that came from years of being important in rooms. Not Ralston. Someone above Ralston. Ethan went to the door alone. He had told Mara to stay in the dining room, and she had given him the look that meant she disagreed with that decision, but was allowing it provisionally. The man on the porch was named Leonard Harlan, and he did not introduce himself as such. But the name did not take long to surface, because he had come without the pretense of anonymity, which told Ethan immediately that this was not a threat. A threat comes with a mask on. This was something else. Harlan was one of the 2 founders of the Harlan Cross Syndicate. He was 61 years old. He had the bearing of a man who had built something significant, and was now watching it crack from the inside, and had made the calculation that controlling the crack was better than pretending it didn't exist. Mr. Calloway, he said. Mr. Harlan, Ethan said. A brief pause. You know who I am. I know who you are. Harlan looked at him with the evaluative quality of a man used to assessing the people across from him quickly and accurately. I'd like to speak with you, and with Mrs. Ellison. You can speak with our attorney. I've spoken with my attorneys. I'm here because I want to speak with the people involved, not the representatives of the people involved. He paused. I understand if that's not acceptable. I'm asking anyway. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought about Mercer's instruction, anyone approaches you, come to me first. He thought about the one more thing. He thought about whether this was a threat in a different configuration than he had imagined, or whether it was something that he did not yet have a name for. He stepped back from the door. Come in. He went to the dining room first and told Mara, and her reaction was not surprise but a careful stillness that meant she was deciding how to be in the room with the man who represented the organization that had taken her husband. I want to be there, she said. It was not a question. I know, he said. That's why I came to tell you. The three of them sat in Adele's dining room with Adele herself very carefully elsewhere, and Leonard Harlan looked at Mara Ellison for a long moment before he spoke. I'm not going to tell you that I didn't know what was happening, he said. That would be an insult to your intelligence and to mine. I knew the general parameters of the operation. What I am going to tell you is that there was a line I drew and that certain people operating on my behalf crossed it without my authorization. Mara said nothing. She was watching him with the particular quality of attention she brought to things she was not yet ready to interpret. Thomas Ellison, Harlan said, the name in the room. I did not order what happened to him, Harlan said. I want that stated clearly. What I ordered was pressure, legal maneuvering, the kind of thing that I had told myself was aggressive, but not. He stopped. His voice had something in it that Ethan could not immediately categorize. There were men acting on my behalf who decided that the pressure was taking too long. I did not find out until afterward, and what I found out afterward, I have lived with it. Lived with it, Mara said. It was the first thing she had said since he sat down. Her voice was entirely even. He's in the ground. You've been living with it. Yes, Harlan said. He did not try to qualify it. That is exactly what I said, and I know what it sounds like. She looked at him for a long, still moment. What do you want from this conversation? To tell you that the men who made that decision, the two men who were sent to your husband the second time, are no longer employed by my company. They have been for 2 years. I severed the connection when I understood what they had done. He paused. I can give their names to the prosecutor. I have been intending to do so through legal channels, but I want you to know it directly. Why now? Ethan said. Because the alternative is to continue in the direction we're heading and have everything come out in the worst possible order and the least possible control. My partner Cross has been the one directing Rolston. I have been aware of it and I did not stop it aggressively enough. That is on me. He looked at his hands on the table briefly, then back up. I'm 61 years old. I built something that I believed in when I started it. I believe it has become something I would not have sanctioned if I had been paying closer attention. And I am past the age where I want to spend the rest of my life defending it. The room held that. It was not a confession in the legal sense. It was something messier than a confession, and more human than most of the transactions that had happened in this case, which was not the same as it being trustworthy. Ethan had encountered enough men who were very good at sounding like they had come to a genuine reckoning to know that the performance of reckoning and the actual thing were not reliably distinguishable in a single conversation. But Harlan's offer the names, the prosecutor, that was concrete. That was a thing that either happened or did not happen. And if it happened, it was something. The other landowners, Mara said. The ones who lost their land through your company's methods. What about them? Harlan was quiet for a moment. I am prepared to negotiate restitution. Not as full compensation for what was taken. That calculation is complicated, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But as acknowledgement that it was taken wrongly. He looked at her. I want to be clear that this is not a legal strategy. My attorneys have told me it is not in my legal interest to make this offer. I am making it because it is the right thing. Mara looked at him for a long time. Ethan watched her and did not speak. I'm going to tell you something, she said finally, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way it might be convenient to hear it. She paused. I don't forgive you. I'm not in a position to do that, and I'm not sure I ever will be. You built a machine that killed my husband and took other people's lives apart, and your late regret does not undo any of that. Harlan held her gaze. I know, but she stopped. Started again. Thomas used to say that the worst thing about wrongdoing isn't the person who does it. It's the silence around it afterward. The way people close ranks and make sure nothing gets acknowledged, and the people who were hurt have to carry the weight of something that was never named. She looked at Harlan directly. If you're willing to name it to the prosecutor on the record, in a way that means something for those families, then that matters. Not to me personally, to them. I'm willing, he said. And talk to Gerald Haste, she said, not to us. We're not the ones who need to hear it officially. Leonard Harlan left Adele Fitch's boarding house 40 minutes later, and when the door closed behind him, Adele appeared from the kitchen with a pot of coffee, like a woman who had been waiting for the correct moment with the patience of considerable experience, and she poured 3 cups and set them on the table and left again without a word. Ethan and Mara sat with the coffee. Do you believe him, he said. About not ordering it? She thought about it honestly. I don't know. I believe that he believes it. Whether it's true men who build the kind of machine he built, have to tell themselves things about how much they know and don't know, and those stories become very convincing over time. She wrapped her hands around the cup. What I believe is that he's going to give those names to Haste, because that part I can verify, and if he does, then there are two men somewhere who made a decision about Thomas, and that decision is going to have a legal accounting. She was quiet for a moment. It won't bring him back. I want to be clear with myself about that. It will mean something. It won't be everything. No, Ethan said. It won't be everything. Nothing ever is, she said. Not bitterly. Just accurately, they left Helena 4 days later. Mercer had what he needed. Haste had opened the formal investigation, and Leonard Harlan had, as he had said, he would provided the names and a preliminary cooperation statement that gave the criminal case against the men responsible for Thomas Ellison's death a foundation it had not had before. Harmon Briggs had been arrested on a Thursday morning. He had spent approximately 6 hours in custody before deciding to cooperate, which was faster than the marshal's office had expected, and which Mercer said was consistent with the profile of a man who had always understood himself as secondary to the operation and who would not sacrifice himself for it. Judge Cord's cooperation statement was formal and on the record and would, Mercer said, effectively end his time on the bench and likely result in a range of legal consequences he was going to spend the next several years navigating. Victor Ralston had retained his own separate legal counsel and was in the process of constructing whatever defense he could build from the position of being Harlan Cross's primary instrument of land fraud in the territory. The machine was broken. Not cleanly, there were pieces still moving, depositions still to be taken, a trial or series of trials that would be months away, but the functional apparatus that had been operating in this county for 6 years, taking land from people who had no way to fight back, was broken. The road back to Silver Creek was cold but clear, and Ethan drove while Mara sat beside him with her coat pulled close and the particular quality of stillness that comes after sustained effort has finished when the body and the mind are both trying to remember what their resting state is supposed to feel like. They were an hour out from Helena when she said, "Thank you." He glanced at her. "Not for what you spent," she said. "I'll pay back what I can eventually when the land starts generating revenue." "That's a separate matter." She paused. "I mean for how you came into this. You could have written a bank draft and sent Mercer a letter and handled it at arm's length, and I think I actually expected you to do something like that at first. It would have been the reasonable thing. It would have been the easy thing," he said. "Those are different sometimes. The easy thing was to be useful from a distance. I'm not sure it would have been enough." He looked at the road. "And I didn't want to be at a distance." She was quiet for a moment. "When did you know that?" He thought about it. The honest answer was that he had known it fairly early and had spent some time arguing with himself about it. Because knowing you want to be in the middle of something difficult and complicated with a specific person is not a simple source of information to absorb. It arrives with implications. It asks things of you. "Somewhere around the time you fixed the window hinge in my cabin without saying anything about it," he said. She looked at him. "That was weeks before any of this started." "Yes," he said, "it was." She turned back to the road ahead. He could not read her exact expression from the angle, but the set of her shoulders was different from what it had been for weeks less braced. Something had been put down. Silver Creek appeared in the late afternoon, the familiar silhouette of it against the winter sky, and Ethan felt the particular complicated feeling of returning to a place that looked exactly the same as you had left it, while you yourself had been changed by the leaving. He had felt it before years ago, coming back from the mountains after Clara. He recognized it now as the sensation of your own life looking slightly foreign for a moment before it readjusts around you. Roy Callister was the first person they encountered, emerging from his feed store as they passed, and he stopped and looked at them for a moment with the expression of a man who has been monitoring a situation from a distance and is now seeing its outcome arrive in real time. "Well," he said. He was looking at Mara. "You came back." "I came back," she said. "Word got here ahead of you." "About the filing, about Briggs," he shook his head. "Harmon Briggs. 20 years I've known that man." "I know," Mara said. "There's going to be a lot of people in this town who have to sit with some things," Roy said. It was not an excuse, and it was not quite an apology, but it was a truthful observation from a man who had watched his community make its calculations, and was now watching it prepare to reckon with them. "Yes," Mara said, "there will be." She did not offer him more than that. He nodded slowly and went back inside, and they drove on. Ethan left Mara at her rented house, and helped bring the trunk inside, and then stood in the doorway for a moment, in the way they had been standing in doorways throughout this whole period, neither of them quite ready to close the gap between one thing and the next. "Come to the cabin," he said, "when you're ready." He stopped. "Not for any particular reason, just come," she looked at him. "Is there a second plate already on the table?" "There has been since the first night," he said. "I never moved it." She held his gaze for a moment with the steady, unguarded quality she had when she was not performing anything for anyone, just being exactly where she was. "I'll come," she said. "Give me a few days." He rode up the mountain in the last light of the afternoon, through the tree line and down to the cabin. And the smoke was not rising from the chimney this time, and there were no horses at the post, and the cabin was exactly what it had always been, a stubborn structure that stayed standing, because it refused to fall. He went inside, built the fire, sat at the table, one plate in front of him, one plate across. He had said it to Mara, and he had meant it. He had not moved the second plate since the night he had gotten up and set it down across from his own. It had been there through the 22 days he had been in Helena, through Pete Gruber's careful management of the ranch, through the winter cold, and the nights he had not been here to see. It had waited. He sat at the table in the warming cabin, with the fire beginning to take hold, and the last light leaving through the west-facing window, and thought about what 6 years on a mountain looks like from the inside versus the outside. From the inside, it looks like clarity, like a man who has identified what he needs and arranged his life accordingly. From this outside, it looks like exactly what it is, which is a man who has stopped asking the world for anything, because the last time he did it took everything. He had spent 6 years being safe. He had not, he understood now, been fully alive in the way that requires exposure to things that could hurt you. Alive in the functional sense, the cattle, the land, the decisions, the money accumulating as money does when no one is spending it on anything that matters. But not alive in the way that requires another person's needs to matter to you. Not alive in the way that requires you to be afraid of losing something again. He had met Mara Ellison, and she had not fixed him. That was not how it worked. And he was old enough and had been alone long enough to be suspicious of any story where one person's arrival constitutes another person's rescue. She had not rescued him from anything. She had simply been there, with her edges and her grief, and her stubbornness, and her capacity for precision under pressure, and being around her had reminded him that the world contained things worth being careful about losing. That was different from being rescued. That was just being reminded that you were still a person. The fire was going well now. The cabin was warm. He got up and went to the window and looked out at the dark mountain, at the shapes of the trees against the sky, at the quiet that had been his chosen landscape for 6 years, and he felt something that he had not expected to feel standing there, which was that the quiet was no longer sufficient. Not unwelcome, just insufficient, like a room that fits one person and is being asked to fit two. He went back to the table and sat with the 2 plates and did not move either of them. 3 days later, Mara came. She came on her horse in the early morning, with a bag and no particular announcement, and he heard the horse at the post and went to the door, and she was already dismounting in the way. She did everything without ceremony, practically, getting on with the thing. She tied the horse and came toward the door, and he stepped back to let her in, and she came inside and took off her coat and looked at the table. 2 plates, second one across from his, right where it had been. She set her bag down. She looked at the cabin the way she looked at things she was assessing without making a show of assessing them. "It's a good cabin," she said. "It's a stubborn one." "That's not a contradiction," she said. She sat down across from his usual place at the second plate's position, as if she had always sat there. As if the plate had been set with exactly that intention which it had. He sat down across from her. The fire was going. Outside, the mountain was doing what it always did, existing without asking permission, without adjusting itself for anyone's comfort or convenience, cold and enormous, and entirely indifferent to human arrangements. That was the thing about places like this, they do not care. The mountain had been here before Ethan Calloway and would be here after him, and in the face of that permanence, the particular temporary arrangements that people made the plates they set, the doors they left open, the things they set in rooms they thought would hold them, were both very small and very important. Ethan looked at Mara across the table. He had owned thousands of acres of Montana. He had cattle and horses, and a name that carried weight in 3 territories. He had money that could buy most problems to silence and land that stretched farther than a man could ride in a day. He had all of that, and had spent 6 years in a cabin on a mountain with 1 plate on the table, and the 1 plate had been enough in the way that surviving is enough sufficient, functional, and entirely missing the point. There is something that money cannot purchase and position cannot confer, and even time cannot guarantee. It is the specific gravity of another person's presence in your life, not their utility, not what they provide or solve or fill, but their actual existence alongside yours. The weight of being known by someone who had no practical reason to know you, who looked at you anyway, who asked the questions that expected honest answers and sat with the honest answers without running from them. He had been alone because he was afraid. He understood that now without shame, because fear is not a weakness, it is a human response to loss, and he had lost something so large that the fear it left behind had felt like wisdom for 6 years. It was not wisdom. It was just a long way around to the same place he had needed to be all along. Mara looked at him across the table. She looked like someone who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time, and had not put it down, would not put it down. Because some things you carry, not because they're burdens, but because they're yours, but who had arrived somewhere that made the carrying different, not lighter, different, held by more than one person rather than one. I have a meeting next week with the Mineral Survey Company, she said. About the eastern parcel, what are you thinking? I'm thinking I don't want to sell. She paused. I'm thinking there's a way to develop the copper rights that doesn't hand control to someone else. I'm thinking Thomas didn't refuse those offers because the money was wrong. He refused them because the land was his and he wanted it to stay that way. She looked at the table. I want it to stay that way. That's a complicated undertaking, he said. Mineral development, on your own terms, without selling. I know, you'd need resources, legal support. Someone who knows how to negotiate mineral rights contracts without giving away the land under them. She looked up at him. I know someone who's good at not being bought. He felt something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. I have opinions about how things should be done, he said. I've been told that's a character flaw. It is, she said. It's also useful sometimes. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines in the way it always had, indifferent and ancient. The fire crackled. The 2 plates sat on the handmade table. There is a thing that happens between people who have been through something difficult together, something that strips away the performances you put on for the world and leaves just the actual person underneath, unpolished and real. It is not romance in the storybook sense. It is not comfort in the uncomplicated sense. It is the specific trust that builds between people who have seen each other at the edge of things, afraid, uncertain, wrong, trying again, and have chosen to keep showing up anyway. That choice, repeated, becomes something you could call love if you were inclined to use that word, or something else if you were not. But either way, it has weight and consequence, and it does not arrive without cost, and is more valuable for that. Ethan Calloway had everything a man could measure in Montana. He had land and cattle and money and a name that opened doors. He had built it and maintained it, and it was real, and it had kept him alive in the years when nothing else was working. But it had not kept him company. It had not set a plate across from his. It had not come up the mountain with a bag and sat down in the second chair like it had always been there, because the chair had always been there, and the plate had always been there, and what had been missing was the person willing to fill them. Looked at Mara across the table and thought about what Thomas Ellison had written in his note. Tell Mara about the copper when this is settled. Don't worry her before. A man who loved his wife enough to try to carry the hard things alone, and was wrong about how to love her, and was right about who she was. A man whose careful handwriting on a survey map had started a chain of events that had ended here in this cabin with his wife sitting at a table, across from a man who had spent 6 years, convinced that an empty chair was a choice he had made. Some things cannot be planned. Some things arrive without announcement and require you to be present for them, and whether you are present or not is the only thing that matters. The fire burned. The mountain stood. The wind moved through things that had been standing long before any of this, and would be standing long after. And in a cabin on a Montana mountain, built by hands that had refused to let it fall, 2 people sat across from each other at a table set for 2, and the day continued around them, ordinary and sufficient, exactly what it was, which was enough, which was, it turned out, everything.